Section 11 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ross Clayton, June 9th, 2K16, Roebuck, South Carolina. The Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1, by Arthur Griffiths, Section 11, Chapter 7, Remarkable Escapes. Escapes from Newgate have been numerous enough, but except in a few cases not particularly remarkable. They miss the extraordinary features of celebrated evasions, such as those of Casanova von Trenck and Latude. The heroes of Newgate, too, were mostly commonplace criminals. There was but little romance about their misdeeds, and they scarcely excite the sympathy which we cannot deny to victims of tyrannical oppression immured under the Piombi of Venice or in the Bastille. They lacked aptitude, moreover, or perhaps opportunity, to weave their stories into thrilling narratives, such as have been preserved from the pens of more scholarly prisoners. Hence the Chronicle of Newgate is somewhat bald and uninteresting as regards escapes. It rings the changes upon conventional stratagems and schemes. All more or less bear testimony to the cunning and adroitness of the prisoners, but all equally prove the keeper's carelessness or cupidity. An escape from prison argues always a want of precaution. This may come of mere neglectfulness, or it may be bought at a price. Against bribery there can be no protection, but long experience has established the watchful supervision which today avails more than bolts and bars and blocks of stone. A prisoner can sooner win through a massive wall than elude a keen-eyed warder's care. Hence in all modern prison construction the old idea of mere solidity has been abandoned, and reliance is placed rather upon the upright intelligence of that which we may term the prison police. The minute inspection of cells and other parts occupied by prisoners, the examination of the prisoners themselves at uncertain times, above all, the intimate acquaintance which those in authority should have of the movements and doings of their charges at all seasons, these are the best safeguards against escapes. In early days, attempts to break prison were generally rude and imperfect. Now and again a rescue was accomplished by force, at risk, however, of a levee of the citizens in vindication of the law. This was the case in 1439, when Philip Malpas and Robert Marshall, the sheriffs of London, recovered a prisoner who had been snatched from their officers' hands. Sometimes the escape followed a riotous upheaval of the inmates of Newgate, as when two of the Percys and Lord Egremond were committed to Newgate for an affray in the north country between them and Lord Salisbury's sons. Soon after their committal, these turbulent aristocrats "broke out of prison and went to the king. The other prisoners took to the leads of the gate, and defended it a long while against the sheriffs and all their officers," till eventually the aid of the citizens had to be called in. In 1520 a prisoner who was so weak and ill that he had to be let down out of Newgate in a basket broke through the people in the Sessions Hall, and took sanctuary in Greyfriars Church. The rest of the story, as told by Holinshed, states that after staying 6 or 7 days in the church, before the sheriffs could speak with him, because he would not abjure the country, and ask the crowner, they took him hence with violence, and cast him again into prison, but the law served not to hang him. In the Calendar of State Papers, under date 1593, there is a reference to a more ingenious method of compassing the enlargement of a prisoner. The scheme was to convey a living body out of Newgate in a coffin, instead of the dead one for which it had been prepared. The prisoner was a member of the congregation or secret conventicle, and the coffin had been made by subscription of the whole society, at a cost of 4 and 8 pence. The State Papers give the examination of one Christopher Bowman, a goldsmith, on the subject, but unfortunately gives few details as to the meditated escape. The idea was to write a wrong name on the coffin lid, and no doubt to trust to a corrupt officer within the prison for the substitution of the bodies. I find another curious but brief reference to escapes in the State Papers about this date. It is the endorsement of "the examination of Robert Bellamy of the manner of his escape from Newgate, from thence to Scotland, and then over to Hamburg, his arrest in the Palsgrave's country, and his conveyance to Duke Casimir." As time passed, the records become fuller, and there is more variety in the operations of the prisoners in their efforts towards freedom. In 1663 a man escaped by his wife changing clothes with him, and got into a hole between two walls in Thomas Court, "but though he had a rug and food, yet the night being wet he wanted beer, and peeping out, he was taken, is brought back prisoner, and will, it is thought, be hanged." Sometimes the prisoners rose against their keepers and tried to set the prison on fire, hoping to get out during the confusion. This was repeatedly tried, in 1615 for instance, and again in 1692 when the prison was actually alight, but the fire was discovered just as certain of the prisoners were in the act of breaking open the prison gates. Sometimes no violence was used, but the prisoner walked off with the connivance of his keeper. This was what occurred with Sir Nicholas Poyntz, who escaped between Newgate and the King's Bench on the road to the latter prison, to which he was being transferred. The references to this case throw some light upon the interior of Newgate in the year 1623. Poyntz had been arrested for killing a man in a street brawl. He had been committed first to the King's Bench, whence, on pretence of his having excited a mutiny in that prison, he was transferred to Newgate and lodged in a dungeon without bed or light, and compelled to lie in a coffin. All this he sets forth in a petition to the high and mighty Prince George, Duke of Buckingham, for whose use he paid the sum of £500 to Sir Edward Villiers, and prays that he may have leave to sue out his habeas corpus or have back his money. No notice having been taken of this appeal, he made shift for himself in the manner described. He was soon afterwards retaken, as appears from other petitions from the under sheriffs, against whom actions had been commenced for allowing the escape. Another somewhat similar case is reported in 1635, where the deputy keeper of Newgate, Edward James by name, was attached and committed to the Fleet for allowing Edward Lunsford, a prisoner in his custody, to go at large. Lunsford was concerned with Lewis and others in a foul attempt to kill Sir Thomas Pelham on a Sunday going to church, and committed under an order of the Star Chamber to Newgate, where he lay for a year. His imprisonment was from time to time relaxed by James, first that he might prosecute his suit to a gentlewoman worth £10,000, and afterwards on account of the prosecutions against him in the Star Chamber. Ultimately, on account of his lameness and sickness, James gave him liberty for the recovery of his health, and he was allowed to lodge out of prison, his father being his surety, and promising that he should be produced when required. But he abused this kindness, and instead of showing himself at regular periods to the keeper, made off altogether. All this is stated in a petition from James, who prays for enlargement on bail that he may pursue and recapture Lunsford. "Lunsford is so lame that he can only go in a coach, and though it is reported that he has been at Gravelines and Cologne, yet he had been seen in town within 10 days." This petition, which is in the State Papers, is underwritten that the Attorney General be directed to prosecute the petitioner in the Star Chamber, and upon it are Secretary Windibank's notes, to the effect that James had received a bribe of £14 to allow Lunsford and his companions to go abroad without a warrant, and one of them to escape. Various sentences were proposed. Lord Coddington suggested that James should pay a fine of £1,000 to the King, imprisonment during pleasure, to be bound to good behaviour when he comes out, and acknowledgments. Secretary Windibank added that he should be put from his place. The Earl Marshal suggested standing with a paper in Westminster Hall, and prosecution of the principal keeper. Archbishop Laud concluded with whipping, and that the chief keeper should be sent for to the council board. The ordinary methods of attempting escape were common enough in Newgate. Quarrying into the walls, breaking up floors, sawing through bars, and picking locks were frequent devices to gain release. In 1679 several prisoners picked out the stones of the prison walls, and 7 who had been committed to Newgate for burglary escaped. No part of the prison was safe from attack, provided only the prisoners had leisure and were unobserved, both of which were almost a matter of course. Now it is a passage through the back of a chimney in a room occupied by the prisoner, now a hole through a wall into a house adjoining the prison. Extraordinary perseverance is displayed in dealing with uncompromising material. The meanest and seemingly most insufficient weapons served. Bars are sewn through like butter. Footnote: the most ingenious and painstaking attempt of this kind was that made by some thugs awaiting sentence in India, who sawed through the bars of their prison with pack thread smeared with oil and coated with fine stone dust. Prisoners rid themselves of their irons as though they were old rags. One man takes a bar out of the chapel window, climbs through, and gets away over the housetops. A gang working in association saw through 8 bars, "each as thick as a man's wrist, leaving enough iron to keep the bars together, and fitting up the notches with dirt and iron rust to prevent discovery." But they are detected in time, and for proper security are all chained to the floor. Another lot are discovered working with large iron crows, meaning to get through the floor. On this occasion a great lot of saws, files, pins, and other tools were found among the prisoners, plainly revealing the almost inconceivable license and carelessness prevailing. Again, 2 men under sentence of death found means to break out of Newgate through walls 6 feet in thickness. They were brothers, and one of them being ill, he was out of humanity removed from his cell to an upper room, where the other was suffered to attend him. As they were both bricklayers by trade, they easily worked through the wall in a night, and so escaped. They were, however, retaken and hanged. The ease with which irons are slipped is shown repeatedly. One man, having attempted to escape, was as usual chained to the floor, yet he managed to get himself loose from an iron collar in which his neck was fastened and his hands extended. This man, when disengaged from the floor, had the resolution to wring the collar from his neck by fixing it between 2 of the bars of the jail window, and thus by main strength he broke it in 2. Others cut through their handcuffs and shackles 2 or 3 times in succession, with the ease of the Davenport brothers freeing themselves from bonds. Jack Sheppard's escapes from Newgate are historical, although much embellished by the novelist's art. Sheppard's success was really marvellous, but it may be explained to some extent by his indomitable pluck, his ingenuity, and his personal activity. As he was still quite a lad when he was hanged in 1724, he could have been barely 22 at the time of his escapes. In the proclamation for his apprehension after his second escape, he is described as about 22 years of age, 5 feet 4 inches in height, very slender, of a pale complexion, having an impediment or hesitation in his speech, and wearing a butcher's blue frock with a greatcoat over it, a carpenter or house joiner by trade. 20 guineas reward was offered to any who might discover or apprehend him. From his early apprenticeship to a carpenter he had much skill and knowledge in the handling of tools. He first became celebrated as a prison breaker by his escapes from the St. Giles Roundhouse and from the New Prison. His first escape from the condemned hold of Newgate, where he lay under sentence of death, was more a proof of ingenuity than of prowess. The usual neglect of proper precautions allowed 2 female visitors to have access to him and to supply him with tools, probably a file and saw. With these he partly divided a spike on the top of the hatch which led from the condemned hold. Upon a second visit from his fair friends, he broke off the spike, squeezed his head and shoulders through the opening, the women then pulling him through. How he got past the lodge where the turnkeys were carousing is not recorded, but it was probably in female disguise. His second escape, following his recapture, and a second sentence of death, was much more remarkable. This escape was, however, only rendered possible by the negligence of his keepers. They visited him at dinner time, and after a careful examination of his irons, having satisfied themselves that he was quite secure, left him for the day. Released thus from all surveillance, time was all that Shepherd needed to effect his escape. He had been chained to the floor by heavy irons which were riveted into a staple fixed in the ground. Various fancy sketches exist of the means of restraint employed, but none can be relied upon as accurate or authentic. Some irons still in existence at Newgate may be akin to those by which Shepherd was secured, but they are hardly the identical fetters. Shepherd was also handcuffed. He is said to have rid himself of these by holding the connecting chain firmly between his teeth, squeezing his fingers as small as possible, and drawing the manacles off. "He next twisted the heavy gyves, round and round, and partly by main strength, partly by a dexterous well applied jerk, snapped asunder the central link by which they were attached to the padlock." Footnote taken from the text of Ainsworth's novel, which gives a clear and picturesque account. It is also accurate, and based on the best accounts extant. He was now free to move about, but the basils still confined his ankles, and he dragged at every step the long connecting chain. He drew up the basils on his calf, and removing his stockings, used them to tie up the chains to his legs. He first attempted to climb up the chimney, but his upward progress was impeded by an iron bar that crossed the aperture. He descended therefore, and from the outside, with a piece of his broken chain, set to work to pick out the stones and bricks so as to release the bar. This he accomplished, and thus obtained an implement about an inch square and nearly a yard long, which was of the utmost service to him in his further operations. The room in which he had been confined was a part of the so-called castle. Above it was the Red Room, and into this he effected an entrance by climbing the chimney and making a fresh hole on the level of the floor above. In the Red Room he found a rusty nail, with which he tried to pick the lock, but failing in this, he wrenched off the plate that covered the bolt and forced the bolt back with his fingers. This Red Room door opened on to a dark passage leading to the chapel. There was a door in it which he opened by making a hole in the wall and pushing the bolt back, and so reached the chapel. Thence he got into an entry between the chapel and the lower leads. "The door of this entry was very strong, and fastened with a great lock. What was worse, the night had now overtaken him, and he was forced to work in the dark. However, in half an hour, by the help of the great nail, the chapel spike, and the iron bar, he forced off the box of the lock and opened the door, which led him to another, yet more difficult, for it was not only locked, but barred and bolted. When he had tried in vain to make this lock and box give way, he wrenched the fillet from the main post of the door, and the box and staples came off with it. There was yet another door betwixt him and the lower leads, but it being bolted withinside, he opened it easily, and mounting to the top of it, he got over the wall, and so to the upper leads." Footnote quoted from the Tyburn Calendar, the wording of which is copied in all other accounts. All that remained for him to do was to descend. There was a house adjoining, that of Mr. Bird, a turner, on to which he might drop, but he deemed the leap too dangerous, and coolly resolved to retrace his steps to the prison chamber from whence he had so laboriously issued, and secure his blanket. Having accomplished this risky service, he returned to the leads, made fast his blanket, slid down it, entered the turner's house by a garret window, and eventually, after some delay and no little danger of detection, got away down into the street. Mr. Austin, the Newgate turnkey, who was specially in charge of Shepherd, and who, on unbolting the castle strong room next morning, found that his prisoner was gone, was amazed beyond measure. The whole of the prison warders ran up, and at sight of the cartloads of rubbish and debris stood like men deprived of their senses. After their first surprise, they got their keys to open the neighbouring strong rooms, hoping that he might not have got entirely away. It was not difficult to follow his track. 6 great doors, one of which it was said had not been opened for 7 years, had been forced, and their massive locks, screws and bolts lay broken in pieces and scattered about the jail. Last of all they came to the blanket, hanging pendant from the leads, and it was plain that Shepherd was already far beyond pursuit. It may be interesting to mention here that he was recaptured, mainly through his own negligence and drunkenness, within a fortnight of his escape. In the interval, after ridding himself of his irons, he had committed several fresh robberies, the most successful being a burglary at a pawnbroker's, where he furnished himself with the fine suit, sword, and snuff-box he possessed at the time of his arrest. When he was brought back to the jail, says a contemporary account, he was very drunk, carried himself insolently, defied the keepers to hold him with all their irons, art, and skill. He was by this time quite a notorious personage. "Nothing contributes so much to the entertainment of the town at present," says another journal of the time, "as the adventures of the housebreaker and jailbreaker John Shepherd. 'Tis thought the keepers of Newgate have got above £200 already by the crowds who daily flock to see him. On Wednesday several noblemen visited him." He sat for his portrait to Sir James Thornhill, the eminent painter, and the likeness was reproduced in a mezzotint which had a large circulation. The following stanzas were written at the time and appeared in the British Journal of November 28, 1724. "Thornhill, 'tis thine to gild with fame the obscure and raise the humble name, to make the form elude the grave, and Shepherd from oblivion save. Though life in vain the wretch implores, in exile on the farthest shores, thy pencil brings a kind reprieve, and bids the dying robber live. Apelles Alexander drew, Caesar is to Aurelius due, Cromwell in Lilly's works doth shine, and Shepherd, Thornhill, lives in thine." 7 different histories or narratives of his adventures were published and illustrated with numerous engravings. His importance was further increased by the special instructions issued to the Attorney General to bring him to immediate trial. A letter from the Duke of Newcastle, then Secretary of State, is preserved in the Hardwicke manuscripts, wherein that great official condescends to convey the King's commands to Sir Philip Yorke that Shepherd, having made 2 very extraordinary escapes, and being a very dangerous person, should be forthwith brought to trial, "to the end that execution may without delay be awarded against him." This letter is dated the 6th November. He was arraigned on the 10th, found guilty, and sentenced the same day. His execution took place on the 16th November, just 1 month after his escape. He exhibited great coolness and effrontery during his trial. He told the court that if they would let his handcuffs be put on, he, by his art, would take them off before their faces. The largest crowds ever seen in London paid testimony to his notoriety as he passed through the streets, and Westminster Hall had not been so densely thronged in the memory of man as at the time of his trial. No pains were spared to ensure his safe custody in Newgate. He was chained to the floor in the condemned hold, and constantly watched night and day by 2 guards. But up to the last Shepherd entertained schemes for eluding justice. He had obtained a penknife by some means or other, and he had intended to cut his cords while actually in the cart going to Tyburn, throw himself in amongst the crowd at a place called Little Turnstile, and run for his life through the narrow passage, along which the mounted officers could not follow him. But this plan was nullified by the discovery of the knife on his person just before he left Newgate. It is said that he had also hopes of resuscitation, and that friends had agreed to cut him down promptly and to apply the usual restoratives. This scheme, if it had ever existed, was probably rendered abortive by the proceedings of the mob after the execution. Shepherd had many imitators but few equals. Possibly the ease with which he broke prison led to an increase in precautions, and I can find no other cases of evasion in Jack Sheppard's manner. There are several instances of attempted escapes by the reverse process, not over the walls, but through them or along the sewers. Burnworth, while in Newgate in 1726, projected a plan of escape. He got an iron crow, and, assisted by certain prisoners, pulled stones out of the walls, while others sung psalms to put the turnkeys off their guard. Next day the officers came to remove 5 convicts awaiting execution, but found the room so full of stones and rubbish that some hours elapsed before the prisoners could be got out, and Burnworth was still in durance. Joshua Dean, capitally convicted in 1731 for counterfeiting stamps, formed a design with 7 other prisoners awaiting transportation to the plantations to break jail. They found means to get down into the common sewer, no doubt by taking up the floor. Thence 4 of them reached a vault under a house in Fleet Lane, and so into the shop, through which 3 got off, but the 4th was secured and carried back to Newgate. The fate of 2, at least, of the remaining 3 was not known till long afterwards. In 1736 a certain Daniel Malden, who had already escaped once, again got out of Newgate by sawing his chains near the staple with which they were fastened to the wall of the condemned hold, and getting through the brickwork and dropping into the common sewer. Several persons were employed to search after him, but to no purpose, though the chains about him weighed nearly 100 pounds. Malden was not discovered, but the searchers came upon the bodies of 2 persons who had been smothered in trying to escape. These were no doubt 2 of those mentioned above. This method of evasion continued to be practised till long afterwards. In 1785 2 convicts cut a hole in the floor of their cell and got into the common sewer to make their escape. But waiting till they were almost suffocated, they at length reached the gully hole, and calling for help were taken out alive, but too weak to walk, and carried to their former quarters. Daniel Malden, who twice in successive years escaped from the condemned hold in Newgate in a manner little less surprising, although less notorious, than Jack Sheppard, had been a man-of-war's man, and served on several of His Majesty's ships. After his discharge he took to burglary and street robberies, for which he was presently arrested and sentenced to suffer death. While lying in the condemned hold, on the very morning of his execution he effected his escape. A previous occupant of the same cell in the condemned hold had told him that a certain plank was loose on the floor, which he found to be true. Accordingly, between 10 and 11 on the night of October 21, 1736, before execution, he began to work, and raised up the plank with the foot of a stool that was in the cell. He soon made a hole through the arch under the floor big enough for his body to pass through, and so dropped into a cell below from which another convict had previously escaped. The window bar of this cell remained cut just as it had been left after this last escape, and Malden easily climbed through with all his irons still on him into the press yard. When there he waited a bit till, seeing all things quiet, he pulled off his shoes and went softly up into the chapel, where he observed a small breach in the wall. He enlarged it, and so got into the penthouse. Making his way through the penthouse, he passed on to the roof. At last, using his own words, "I got upon the top of the cells by the ordinary's house, having made my way from the top of the chapel upon the roofs of the houses, and all round the chimneys of the cells over the ordinary's house." From this he climbed along the roofs to that of an empty house, and finding one of the garret windows open, entered it and passed down 3 pairs of stairs into the kitchen, where he put on his shoes again, "which I had made shift to carry in my hand all the way I came, and with rags and pieces of my jacket wrapped my irons close to my legs as if I had been gouty or lame. Then I got out at the kitchen window, up 1 pair of stairs into Phoenix Court, and from thence through the streets to my home in Nightingale Lane." Here he lay till 6 o'clock, then sent for a smith, who knocked off his irons and took them away with him for his pains. Then he asked for his wife, who came to him, but while they were at breakfast, hearing a noise in the yard, he made off, and took refuge at Mrs. Newman's, "the sign of the Black Boy, Millbank." There I was kept private and locked up 4 days alone, and no soul by myself." Unquote. Venturing out on the 5th day, he heard they were in pursuit of him, and again took refuge, this time in the house of a Mrs. Franklin. From thence he dispatched a shoemaker with a message to his wife, and letters to 2 gentlemen in the city. But the messenger betrayed him to the Newgate officers, and in about an hour, "the house was beset. I hid myself," says Malden, "behind the shutters in the yard, and my wife was drinking tea in the house. The keepers, seeing her, cried, 'Your humble servant, madam, where is your spouse?' I heard them, and knowing I was not safe, endeavoured to get over a wall, when some of them espied me, crying, 'Here he is!' upon which they immediately laid hold of me, carried me back to Newgate, put me into the old condemned hold as the strongest place, and stapled me down to the floor." Unquote. Nothing daunted by this first failure, he resolved to attempt a second escape. A fellow prisoner conveyed a knife to him, and on the night of June 6, 1737, he began to saw the staple to which he was fastened in two. His own story is worth quoting. "I worked through it with much difficulty, and with one of my irons wrenched it open and got it loose. Then I took down, with the assistance of my knife, a stone in front of the seat in the corner of the condemned hold. When I had got the stone down, I found there was a row of strong iron bars under the seat through which I could not get, so I was obliged to work under these bars and open a passage below them. To do this I had no tool but my old knife, and in doing the work my nails were torn off the ends of my fingers, and my hands were in a dreadful, miserable condition. At last I opened a hole just big enough for me to squeeze through, and in I went head foremost, but one of my legs, my irons being on, stuck very fast in the hole, and by this leg I hung in the inside of the vault with my head downward for half an hour or more. I thought I should be stifled in this sad position, and was just going to call out for help, when, turning myself up, I happened to reach the bars. I took fast hold of them by one hand, and with the other disengaged my leg to get it out of the hole." Unquote. When clear, he had still a drop of some 30 feet, and to break his fall he fastened a piece of blanket he had about him to one of the bars, hoping to lower himself down. But it broke, and he fell with much violence into a hole under the vault. "My fetters causing me to fall very heavy, and here I stuck for a considerable time." Unquote. This hole proved to be a funnel. "Very narrow and straight. I had torn my flesh in a terrible manner by the fall, but was forced to tear myself much worse in squeezing through." Unquote. He stuck fast and could not stir either backward or forward for more than half an hour. "But at last, what with squeezing my body, tearing my flesh off my bones, and the weight of my irons which helped me a little here, I worked myself through." Unquote. The funnel communicated with the main sewer, in which, as well as he could, he cleaned himself. "My shirt and breeches were torn in pieces, but I washed them in the muddy water, and walked through the sewer as far as I could, my irons being very heavy on me and incommoding me much." Unquote. Now a new danger overtook him. His escape had been discovered, and its direction. Several of the Newgate runners had therefore been let into the sewer to look for him. "And here," he says, "I had been taken again, had I not found a hollow place in the side of the brickwork, into which I crowded myself, and they passed by me twice while I stood in that nook." Unquote. He remained 48 hours in the sewer, but eventually got out in a yard against the pump in Town Ditch, behind Christ's Hospital. Once more he narrowly escaped detection, for a woman in the yard saw and suspected him to be after no good. However, he was suffered to go free, and got as far as Little Britain, where he came across a friend who gave him a pot of beer and procured a smith to knock off his fetters. Malden's adventures after this were very varied. He got first to Enfield, when some friends subscribed 45 shillings to buy him a suit of clothes at Rag Fair. Thence he passed over to Flushing, where he was nearly persuaded to take foreign service, but he refused, and returned to England in search of his wife. Finding her, the two wandered about the country, taking what work they could find. While at Canterbury, employed in the hop fields, he was nearly discovered by a fellow who beat the drum in a show, and who spoke of him openly as "a man who had broken twice out of Newgate." Next he turned jockey, and while thus employed was betrayed by a man to whom he had been kind. Malden was carried before the Canterbury justices on suspicion of being the man who had escaped from Newgate, and a communication was sent to the authorities of that prison. Mr. Ackerman and 2 of his officers came in person to identify the prisoner, and, if the true Malden, to convey him back to London. But Malden once more nearly gave his jailers the slip. He obtained somehow an old saw, a spike such as is used for splicing ropes, a piece of an old sword jagged and notched, and an old knife. These he concealed, rather imprudently, upon his person, where they were seen and taken from him, otherwise Mr. Ackerman, as Malden told him, "would have been like to have come upon a Canterbury story," instead of the missing prisoner. However, the Newgate officers secured Malden effectually, and brought him to London on the 26th of September, 1737, which he reached, "guarded by about 30 or 40 horsemen, the roads all the way being lined with spectators. Thus was I got to London," he says in his last dying confession, "handcuffed, and my legs chained under the horse's belly. I got to Newgate that Sunday evening about 5 o'clock, and rid quite up into the lodge, where I was taken off my horse, then was conveyed up to the old condemned hole, handcuffed and chained to the floor." On Friday, the 15th October, the last day of sessions, Malden was called into court, and informed that his former judgment of death must be executed upon him, and he was accordingly hanged upon the 2nd November following. Stratagem and disguise in some shape or other were, however, the most favourite and generally the most successful forms of escape. Extraordinary and quite culpable facilities for changing clothes were given by the lax discipline of the prison. The substitution of persons, devoted wife or friend taking the place of the accused, as in the story of Sidney Carton as told by Dickens, or the well-known exchange between Lord and Lady Nithsdale, which occurred at Newgate. George Flint, an imprisoned journalist, who continued to edit his objectionable periodical from the prison, got away in the costume of a footman. His wife was suffered to live with him, and helped him to the disguise. She concealed the escape for 2 or 3 days, pretending that her husband was dangerously ill in bed, and not fit to be disturbed, for which fidelity to her husband, who was now beyond the seas, having made the most of the time thus gained, Mrs. Flint was cast into the condemned hold, and "used after a most barbarous manner to extort a confession." Another very similar and unsuccessful case was that of Alexander Scott, a highwayman suspected of robbing the Worcester and Portsmouth mails. Scott attempted to get out in the habit of an oyster woman, whom his wife had persuaded to favour their design. The change was made, and the lodge bell rung to give egress to Scott. Unfortunately for the prisoner, the gatekeeper was dilatory. Meanwhile an assistant turnkey, missing Scott, conjectured that he had escaped, and seeing the oyster woman standing at the gate, began to question her, and insisted upon looking at her face. Scott being at once detected, he struck the turnkey a blow in the face, hoping to knock him down. A scuffle ensued. The turnkey proved the strongest, and Scott was secured. Female disguise was one of the many methods employed by the imprisoned Jacobites to compass escape, but it was not always successful. Among others, Mr. Barlow of Burton Hall tried it. In the first instance, a crazy woman, Elizabeth Powell, well known in Westminster Market, came to Mr. Barlow with a whole suit of female apparel, but he, fearing it might be a trick, or that he might fail in the attempt, discovered her. A week or 2 later, as if inspired by the proposal, Mr. Barlow did make the attempt. Close shaved and neatly dressed in female clothes, he came to the gate with a crowd of ladies who had been visiting their Jacobite friends, hoping to pass out unobserved with the others. But the turnkey (escapes had been very frequent, and all officials were on the alert) caught hold of him, turned him about, and in the struggle threw him down. The rest of the women cried out in a lamentable tone, "Don't hurt the poor lady, she is with child," and some of them cried, "Oh, my dear mother!" whereupon the turnkey, convinced he had to do with a lady, let him go. Mr. Barlow says the account acted the part to the life. He was "padded," his face was painted red and white, and he would certainly have made his escape had not Mr. Carleton Smith, one of the special commissioners appointed to ensure the safe custody of the rebels, strictly examined the would-be fugitive and detected his disguise. Mr. Barlow offered Smith 10 guineas to let him go, but instead of accepting the bribe, Mr. Smith carried his prisoner just as he was, in female disguise, before the court then sitting at the Old Bailey. Mr. Barlow declared that the clothes had been brought him by his wife. The court, says the account, was very well pleased to see him thus metamorphosed, but ordered him to be put in heavy irons, and the clothes to be kept as a testimony against him. The circumstances under which Mr. Pitt, the governor of Newgate, was superseded in his functions have been described in a previous chapter. Mr. Pitt was so strongly suspected of Jacobite leanings that he was tried for his life. No doubt escapes were scandalously frequent during his regime, and it is just possible that they were due to the governor's complicity, although Mr. Pitt was actually acquitted of the charge. More probably they owed their success to the ingenuity of desperate men, easily triumphing over the prevailing carelessness of their keepers. The first escape which made a considerable noise was that of Mr. Forster, commonly known as General Forster, who headed the Northumbrian rising in 1715 and lost the battle of Preston Pans. Mr. Forster was allowed considerable liberty, and lodged in apartments in the keeper's house. One afternoon, when Forster and another were drinking French wine with Mr. Pitt, Mr. Forster sent his servant to fetch a bottle of wine from his own stock to "make up the treat." The servant, on pretence of going to the vault, left the room. Being long away, Mr. Forster pretended to be very angry, and followed him out. Meanwhile the servant had sent the governor's black man, a species of hybrid turnkey, down to the cellar for the wine, and had locked him up there. The black thus disposed of, Forster's servant returned and waited for his master just outside Mr. Pitt's parlour door. Being an adept at the locksmith's art, as well as a smart and intelligent fellow, the servant had previously obtained an impression in clay of Mr. Pitt's front door key, and had manufactured a counterfeit key. Directly Mr. Forster appeared, the front door was unlocked, master and servant passed through and went off together, first taking care to lock the door on the outside and leave the key in the lock, to prevent their being readily pursued. Mr. Forster got to Prittlewell in Essex by 4 o'clock next morning, with 2 more horsemen that had been waiting to attend them. From Prittlewell they hastened on to Lee, where a vessel was provided, in which they made a safe voyage to France. "By this it appears," says the chronicler, evidently a stout Whig, "that Mr. Forster was much better skilled in contriving an escape than leading an army, which shows the weakness of the Pretender and his council, who put so great a trust in the hands of a person who was altogether unfit for it, and never made other campaign than to hunt a fox and drink down his companions." The next attempt was on a larger scale. It was planned by Brigadier Mackintosh, with whom were Mr. Wogan, 2 of the Delmehoys, Mr. James Talbot, and the Brigadier's son, with several others, to the number of 15 in all. The prime mover was the Brigadier, who having "made a shift to get off his irons, and coming down with them in his hand under his gown, caused a servant to knock at the jail door outside, himself sitting close by it." As soon as the door was opened, he pushed out with great violence, knocking down the turnkey and 2 or 3 of the sentinels. One of the soldiers made a thrust at him with his bayonet, but the Brigadier parried the charge, seized the piece, unscrewed the bayonet, and menaced it at the breast of the soldier, who thereupon gave way, and suffered him and 14 more to get into the street. 8 of the fugitives were almost immediately recaptured, but the other gentlemen got clean off. One of them was Mr. James Talbot, who, unhappily, fell again into the hands of the authorities. He was discovered by the chance gossip of a garrulous maid servant, who, chattering at an alehouse in Windmill Street, near the Haymarket, said her master had a cousin come to see him, who had the whitest hands she ever saw in her life. This caused suspicion, and suspicion brought discovery. A reward of £500 had been offered by proclamation for the arrest of any fugitives except the brigadier, who was valued at £1,000, and Talbot was given up. The escapes did not end here. The next to get away was Mr. George Budden, an upholsterer who had a shop near Fleetbridge, a Jacobite, but not in the rebellion of 1715. He effected his escape at the time when Mr. Pitt was himself a prisoner, suspected of collusion in the previous evasions. Mr. Budden's plan was simple. He was possessed of money, and had friends who could help to convey him away could he but get out of Newgate. One night as he sat drinking with the head turnkey, Mr. Budden purposely insulted the officer grossly, and even went so far as to strike him. The turnkey was furious, and carried off his prisoner to the lodge, there to be heavily ironed, Mr. Budden trusting that either on the way there or back he might contrive to escape. On reaching the lodge, Mr. Budden apologized and "made atonement to the good-natured keeper, who was a little mellower than ordinary," and was led back to his former apartment. On the way he turned up the keeper's heels and made off through the gate. Once outside, Budden ran into Newgate Market, and thence by many windings and turnings out of London, riding post haste 70 miles to the coast, and so across to France. There were other attempts, such as that of Mr. Robertson, who tried to make off in a clergyman's habit, but was discovered and stopped before he had passed one of the doors, and of Mr. Ramsay, who escaped with the crowd that came to hear the condemned sermon. Now and then there was the concerted action of a number, as when the prisoners thronged about the gates in order to make their escape. Trouble again was only prevented by timely warning that there was a design to convey large iron crows to the rebels, by which they might beat open the gaol and escape. The most important and about the last of the rebel escapes was that of Mr. Ratcliffe, brother of the unfortunate Lord Derwentwater. This was effected so easily, indeed with so much cool impudence, that connivance must assuredly have been bought. Mr. Ratcliffe seized his opportunity one day when he was paying a visit to Captain Dalziel and others on the master's side. At the gate he met by previous agreement a cane jobber, or person who sold walking sticks, and who had once been an inmate of Newgate himself. Mr. Ratcliffe paused for a time and bargained for a cane, after which he passed under the iron chain at the gate, and upon the cane seller saying that he was no prisoner, the turnkey and guard suffered Ratcliffe to get off. The author of the History of the Press Yard says that Mr. Ratcliffe bribed the officer, which, as another writer adds, must be owned to be the readiest way to turn both lock and key. Mr. Ratcliffe 30 years later paid the penalty to the law which he had escaped on this occasion. A warm adherent of the Pretender, he embarked from France for Scotland to take part in the Jacobite rising in 1745. The French ship was captured, and Ratcliffe sent as a prisoner to the Tower. He was presently arraigned at the bar of the King's Bench for having escaped from Newgate in 1716, when under sentence of death for high treason. Ratcliffe at first refused to plead, declaring that he was a subject of the French king and that the court had no jurisdiction over him. Then he denied that he was the person named in the record produced in court, whereupon witnesses were called to prove that he was Charles Ratcliffe. 2 Northumbrian men identified him as the leader of 500 of the Earl of Derwentwater's men, remembering him by the scar on his face. They had been to see him in the Tower and could swear to him, but could not swear that he was the same Charles Ratcliffe who had escaped from Newgate prison. A barber who had been appointed close shaver to Newgate in 1715, and who attended the prison daily to shave all the rebel prisoners, remembered Charles Ratcliffe, Esquire, perfectly as the chum or companion of Basil Hamilton, a reputed nephew of the Duke of Hamilton, but this barber, when closely pressed, could not swear that the prisoner at the bar was the very same Charles Ratcliffe whom he had shaved, and who had afterwards escaped out of Newgate. No evidence indeed was forthcoming to positively fix Mr. Ratcliffe's identity, but a gentleman was called who deposed that the prisoner had in the Tower declared himself to be the same Charles Ratcliffe who was condemned in the year 1716, and had likewise told him, the witness, that he had made his escape out of Newgate in mourning, with a brown tie wig, when under sentence of death in that gaol. Upon this evidence the judge summed up against the prisoner, the jury found a verdict of guilty, and Ratcliffe was eventually beheaded on Tower Hill. End of section 11.
Section 12 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1, by Arthur Griffiths. Section 12. Newgate in the 18th Century, Part 1. Prison calendars obviously reflect the criminal features of the age in which they appear. Those of Newgate since the beginning of the 18th century are numerous and voluminous enough to form a literature of their own. To the diligence of lawyers and publishers we owe a more or less complete collection of the most remarkable cases as they occurred. These volumes have been published under various titles. The Newgate Calendar, compiled by Messrs. Knapp and Baldwin, attorneys at law, is one of the best known. This work, according to its title page, professes to contain interesting memoirs of notorious characters who have been convicted of outrages on the law of England, with essays on crimes and punishments and the last exclamations of sufferers. There are many editions of it. The first was undoubtedly published by Nuttall, Fisher and Dixon of Liverpool. A later edition issued from the Albion Press, Ivy Lane, London, under the auspices of J. Robbins and Company. But another book of similar character had as its compiler George Theodore Wilkinson, Esquire, barrister at law. It was published by Cornish and Company in 1814, and the work was continued by William Jackson, Esquire, another barrister, with Alexander Hogg of Paternoster Row, and by Offa and Son of Tower Hill as publishers. Early and perfect editions of these works are somewhat rare and curious, fondly sought out and carefully treasured by the bibliophile. But all of them were anticipated by the editors of the Tyburn Calendar, or Malefactor's Bloody Register, which appeared soon after 1700 from the printing office of G. Swindles, at the appropriate address of Hanging Bridge, Manchester. The compilers of these volumes claimed a high mission. They desired "to fully display the regular progress from virtue to vice, interspersed with striking reflections on the conduct of those unhappy wretches who have fallen a sacrifice to the injured laws of their country, the whole tending to guard young minds from allurements of vice and the paths that lead to destruction." Another early work is the Chronicle of Tyburn, or Villainy Displayed in all its Branches, which gave the authentic lives of notorious malefactors, and was published at the Shakespeare's Head in 1720. Yet another, dated 1776, and printed for J. Wenman of 144 Fleet Street, bears the title of The Annals of Newgate, and claims, upon the title page, that by giving the circumstantial accounts of the lives, transactions, and trials of the most notorious malefactors, it is "calculated to expose the deformity of vice, the infamy and punishments naturally attending those who deviate from the paths of virtue, and is intended as a beacon to warn the rising generation against the temptations, the allurements, and the dangers of bad company." All Newgate calendars have seemingly a common origin. They are all based primarily upon the Sessions Papers, the official publications which record the proceedings at the Old Bailey. There is a complete early series of these Sessions Papers in the library of the British Museum, and another in the Home Office from the year 1730, including the December sessions in 1729. The publisher, who is stated on the title page to be T. Payne, at the corner of Ivy Lane near Paternoster Row, refers in his preface to an earlier series dating probably from the beginning of the century, and a manuscript note in the margin of the first volume of the second series also speaks of a preceding folio volume. These Sessions papers did not issue from one publisher. As the years pass the publication changes hands. Now it is J. Wilford behind the Chapter House, St. Paul's. Now I. Roberts at the Oxford Arms in Warwick Lane. Ere long T. Appleby in Bolt Court near the Leg Tavern turns his attention to this interesting class of periodical literature. He also published another set of semi-official documents, several numbers of which are bound up with the Sessions papers already mentioned, and like them supplying important data for the compilation of calendars. These were the accounts given by the Ordinary of Newgate of the behaviour, confessions, and dying words of the malefactors executed at Tyburn, a report rendered by command of the Mayor and Corporation, but a private financial venture of the chaplains. As the Ordinary had free access to condemned convicts at all times, and from his peculiar duties generally established the most confidential relations with them, he was in a position to obtain much curious and often authentic information from the lips of the doomed offenders. Hence the Ordinary's account contained many criminal autobiographies, and probably was much patronized by the public. Its sale was a part of the reverend gentleman's perquisites, and that the chaplains looked closely after the returns may be gathered from the already mentioned application made by the Reverend Mr. Lorraine, chaplain in 1804, who petitioned Parliament to exempt his execution brochure from the paper tax. In the advertisement sheets of these Sessions papers are notices of other criminal publications, proving how great was the demand for this kind of literature. Thus in 1731 is announced "The History of Executions, being a complete account of the 13 malefactors executed at Tyburn for robberies, price 4d." And this publication is continued from year to year. In 1732 T. Appleby and others published at 3s. 6d. the Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, a volume containing as a frontispiece the escape of Jack Sheppard from Newgate. In the description of this book the public is assured that the volume contains a first and faithful narration of each case, without any additions of feigned or romantic adventures calculated merely to entertain the curiosity of the reader. Jack Sheppard had many biographers. 7 accurate and authentic histories were published, all purporting to give the true story of his surprising adventures, and bequeathing a valuable legacy to the then unborn historical novelist, Mr. Harrison Ainsworth. Again, Rich, the manager of the Lincoln's Inn Theatre, brought out Harlequin Jack Sheppard in the year of that desperado's execution, an operatic pantomime founded upon his exploits. A little before this another dramatic performance, The Beggar's Opera, having a criminal for its hero, had taken the town by storm, and many strongly, and with reason, condemned the degradation of national taste which could popularize the loves of Polly Peachum and Captain Macheath. Besides these books and plays there was a constant publication of broadsheets and chapbooks of a still lower type, intended to pander to the same unwholesome taste, while a great novelist like Fielding did not hesitate to draw upon his personal acquaintance with crime, obtained as a police magistrate, and write the life of Jonathan Wild. The demand was no doubt fostered by the extraordinary prevalence of crime in England. Criminal records would probably be read with avidity at times when ruffianism was in the ascendant, and offences of the most heinous description were of daily occurrence. New crimes cropped up daily. The whole country was a prey to lawlessness and disorder. Outrages of all kinds, riots, robberies, murders took place continually. None of the high roads or by roads were safe by night or day. Horsemen in the open country, footpads in or near towns, harassed and pillaged wayfarers. Armed parties ranged the rural districts, attacking country houses in force, driving off cattle and deer, and striking terror everywhere. The general turbulence often broke out into open disturbance. The Riot Act, which was a product of these times, was not passed before it was needed. Riots were frequent in town and country. The mob was easily roused, as when it broke open the house of the Provost Marshal Tooley in Holborn, to whom they owed a grudge for impressing men to sell as recruits to Flanders. They burned his furniture in the street, and many persons were killed and wounded in the affray. Now political parties, inflamed with rancorous spirit, created uproars in the mug-houses. Now mutinous soldiers violently protested against the coarse linen of their Hanover shirts. Again the idle flunkeys at a London theatre rose in revolt against new rules introduced by the management, and produced a serious riot. In the country, gangs of ruffians disguised in female attire, the forerunners of Rebecca and her daughter, ran amuck against turnpike gates, demolishing all they found. There were smuggling riots, when armed crowds overpowered the customs officers and broke into warehouses sealed by the Crown; corn riots at periods of scarcity, when private granaries were forced and pillaged. And still worse crime prevailed, that of arson. I find in Hardwicke's Life reference to a proclamation offering a reward for the detection of those who sent threatening letters to divers persons in the cities of London, Westminster, Bristol, and Exeter, requiring them to deposit certain sums of money in particular places, and threatening to set fire to their houses, and to burn and destroy them and their families in case of refusal, some of which threats have accordingly been carried into execution. Other threats were to murder unless a good sum was at once paid down. Thus Jephthah Bigg was tried in 1729 for writing 2 letters, demanding in one 85 guineas, in the other 100 guineas, from Nathaniel Newnham, a fearful old man, and threatening to murder both himself and wife unless he got the money. Jephthah Bigg was found guilty and sentenced to death. The state of the metropolis was something frightful in the early decades of the 18th century. Such was the reckless daring of evildoers that there was but little security for life and property. Wright, in his caricature history of the Georges, says of this period, "Robbery was carried on to an extraordinary extent in the streets of London, even by daylight. Housebreaking was of frequent occurrence by night, and every road leading to the metropolis was beset by bands of reckless highwaymen, who carried their depredations into the very heart of the town. Respectable women could not venture in the streets alone after nightfall, even in the city, without risk of being grossly insulted." In 1720 ladies going to court were escorted by servants armed with blunderbusses to shoot at the rogues. Wright gives a detailed account of 25 robberies perpetrated within 3 weeks in January and February of the year above mentioned. A few of the most daring cases may be quoted. 3 highwaymen stopped a gentleman of the prince's household in Poland Street, and made the watchman throw away his lantern, and stand quietly by while they robbed and ill-used their victim. Other highwaymen the same night fired at Colonel Montague's carriage as it passed along Frith Street, Soho, because the coachman refused to stand; and the Duchess of Montrose, coming from court in her chair, was stopped by highwaymen near Bond Street. The mails going out and coming into London were seized and rifled. Postboys, stage coaches, everybody and everything that travelled, were attacked. A great peer, the Duke of Chandos, was twice stopped during the period above mentioned, but he and his servants were too strong for the villains, some of whom they captured. People were robbed in Chelsea, in Cheapside, in White Conduit Fields, in Denmark Street, St. Giles. Wade, in his British Chronology, under the head of Public Calamities in 1729, classes with a sickly season, perpetual storms, and incessant rains, the dangerous conditions of the cities of London and Westminster and their neighbourhoods, which "proceeded from the number of footpads and street robbers, insomuch that there was no stirring out after dark for fear of mischief. These ruffians knocked people down and wounded them before they demanded their money." Large rewards were offered for the apprehension of these offenders. Thief catchers and informers were continually active, and the law did not hesitate to strike all upon whom it could lay its hands. Yet crime still flourished and increased year after year. The Englishman's house, and proverbially his castle, was no more secure then than now from burglarious inroads. Housebreakers abounded, working in gangs with consummate skill and patience, hand and glove with servants past and present, associated with receivers, and especially with the drivers of night coaches. Half the hackney coachmen about this time were in league with thieves, being bribed by nocturnal depredators to wait about when a robbery was imminent and until it was completed. Then, seizing the chance of watchmen being off their beat, these useful accomplices drove at once to the receiver with the swag. Towards the middle of the century, Henry Fielding, the great novelist, and at that time acting magistrate for Westminster, wrote, "I make no doubt but that the streets of this town and the roads leading to it will shortly be impassable without the utmost hazard, nor are we threatened with seeing less dangerous groups of rogues amongst us than those which the Italians call banditti." Again, "If I am to be assaulted and pillaged and plundered, if I can neither sleep in my own house, nor walk the streets, nor travel in safety, is not my condition almost equally bad whether a licensed or an unlicensed rogue, a dragoon or a robber, be the person who assaults and plunders me?" Those who set the law at defiance organized themselves into gangs, and co-operated in crime. Fielding tells us in the same work that nearly 100 rogues were incorporated in one body, "have offices and a treasury, and have reduced theft and robbery into a regular system." Among them were men who appeared in all disguises and mixed in all companies. The members of the society were not only versed in every art of cheating and thieving, but they were armed to evade the law, and if a prisoner could not be rescued, a prosecutor could be bribed, or some rotten member of the law forged a defence supported by false witnesses. This must have been perpetuated, for I find another reference later to the Thieves' or Housebreakers' Company, which had regular books, kept clerks, opened accounts with members, and duly divided the profits. According to the confession of 2 of the gang, who were executed on Kensington Common, they declared that their profits amounted on an average to £500 a year, and that one of them had put by £2000 in the stocks, which before his trial he made over to a friend to preserve it for his family. Another desperate gang, Waite says, was so audacious that they went to the houses of the peace officers and made them beg pardon for endeavouring to do their duty, and promised not to molest them. They went further, and even attacked and wounded a head borough in St. John Street in about 40 places, so that many of the threatened officers had to lie in Bridewell for safety. In Harris's Life of Lord Hardwicke is a letter from the Solicitor to the Treasury to Sir Philip Yorke, referring to "the gang of ruffians who are so notorious for their robberies, and have lately murdered Thomas Bull in Southwark, and wounded others. Their numbers daily increase, and now become so formidable that constables are intimidated by their threats and desperate behaviour from any endeavour to apprehend them." One of these ruffians was described in the proclamation offering rewards for their apprehension as "above 6 feet high, black eyebrows, his teeth broke before." Another had a large scar under his chin. Still worse was the Resolution Club, a numerous gang regularly organized under stringent rules. It was one of their articles that whoever resisted or attempted to fly when stopped should be instantly cut down and crippled. Any person who prosecuted or appeared as evidence against a member of the club should be marked down for vengeance. The members took an infernal oath to obey the rules, and if taken and sentenced, to die mute. Another instance of the lawlessness of the times is to be seen in the desperate attack made by some 40 ruffians on a watch-house in Moorfields, where an accomplice was kept a prisoner. They were armed with pistols, cutlasses, and other offensive weapons. The watchman was wounded, the prisoner rescued. After this the assailants demolished the watch-house, robbed the constables, committed several unparalleled outrages, and went off in triumph. The gang was too numerous to be quickly subdued, but most of the rioters were eventually apprehended, and it is satisfactory to learn that they were sentenced to imprisonment in Newgate for 3, 5, or 7 years, according to the part they had played. The contempt of the majesty of the law was not limited to the lower and dangerous classes. A gentleman's maidservant, having resisted the parish officers who had a distress warrant upon the gentleman's house for unpaid rates, was committed by the magistrates to Newgate. The gentleman, by name William Frankland, on learning what had happened, armed himself with a brace of pistols, and went to the office where the justices were then sitting, and asked which of them had dared to commit his servant to prison. Mr. Miller, so runs the account, "smilingly replied, 'I did,' on which the gentleman fired one of his pistols and shot Mr. Miller in the side, but it is thought did not wound him mortally. He was instantly secured and committed to Newgate." At the following Old Bailey sessions he was tried under the Black Act, when he pleaded insanity. This did not avail him, and although the jury in convicting him strongly recommended him to mercy, he was sentenced to death. Another case of still more flagrant contempt of court may fitly be introduced here. At the trial of a woman named Housden for coining at the Old Bailey in 1712, a man named Johnson, an ex-butcher and highwayman by profession, came into court and desired to speak to her. Mr. Spurling, the principal turnkey of Newgate, told him no person could be permitted to speak to the prisoner, whereupon Johnson drew out a pistol and shot Mr. Spurling dead upon the spot, the woman Housden loudly applauding his act. The court did not easily recover from its consternation, but presently the recorder suspended the trial of the woman for coining, and as soon as an indictment could be prepared, Johnson was arraigned for the murder, convicted, and then and there sentenced to death. The woman Housden being also sentenced at the same time as an accessory before and after the fact. Various causes are given for this great prevalence of crime. The long and impoverishing wars of the early years of the century, which saddled England with the national debt, no doubt produced much distress, and drove thousands who could not or would not find honest work into evil ways. Manners among the highest and the lowest were generally profligate. Innumerable places of public diversion, ridottos, balls, masquerades, tea gardens, and wells, offered crowds a ready means for self-indulgence. Classes aped the habits of the classes above their own, and the love of luxurious gratification reached to the dregs of the people, said Fielding, "who, not being able by the fruits of honest labour to support the state which they affect, they disdain the wages to which their industry would entitle them, and abandoning themselves to idleness, the more simple and poor-spirited betake themselves to a state of starving and beggary, while those of more art and courage became thieves, sharpers, and robbers." Drunkenness was another terrible vice, even then more rampant and wildly excessive than in later years. While the aristocracy drank deep of Burgundy and port, and every roaring blade disdained all heel taps, the masses fuddled and besotted themselves with gin. This last named pernicious fluid was as cheap as dirt. A gin shop actually had on its sign the notice, "Drunk for 1 penny, dead drunk for 2 pennies, clean straw for nothing," which Hogarth introduced into his caricature of Gin Lane. No pencil could paint, no pen describe, the scenes of hideous debauchery hourly enacted in the dens and purlieus of the town. Legislation was powerless to restrain the popular craving. The Gin Act, passed in 1736 amidst the execrations of the mob, which sought to vent its rage upon Sir Joseph Jekyll, the chief promoter of the bill, was generally evaded. The much-loved poisonous spirit was still retailed under fictitious names, such as Sangree, Toro, the Makeshift, and King Theodore of Corsica. It was prescribed as a medicine for colic, to be taken 2 or 3 times a day. Numberless tumults arose out of the prohibition to retail spirituous liquors, and so openly was the law defied, that 12,000 persons were convicted within 2 years of having sold them illegally in London. Informers were promptly bought off or intimidated, magistrates, through fear or corruption, would not convict, and the Act was repealed in the hope that more moderate duty and stricter enforcement of the law would benefit the revenue and yet lessen consumption. The first was undoubtedly effected, but hardly the latter. Fielding, writing nearly 10 years after the repeal of the Act, says that he has reason to believe that "Gin is the principal sustenance, if it may be so called, of more than 100,000 people in the metropolis," and he attributed to it most of the crimes committed by the wretches with whom he had to deal. "The intoxicating draught itself disqualifies them from any honest means to acquire it, at the same time that it removes sense of fear and shame, and emboldens them to commit every wicked and desperate enterprise." End of section 12. Section 13 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1, by Arthur Griffiths. Section 13. Newgate in the 18th Century, Part 2. The passion for gaming, again, the school in which most highwaymen of great eminence have been bred, was a fruitful source of immoral degeneracy. Every one gambled. In the Gentleman's Magazine for 1731 there is the following entry: "At night their Majesties played for the benefit of the groom porter, and the King, George II., and Queen, each won several hundreds, and the Duke of Grafton several thousands of pounds." His Majesty's lieges followed his illustrious example, and all manner of games of chance with cards or dice, such as hazard, faro, basset, roly-poly, were the universal diversion in clubs, public places, and private gatherings. The law had thundered, but to no purpose, against this destructive vice, inflicting fines on those who indulged in it, declaring securities won at play void, with other penalties, yet gaming throve and flourished. It was fostered and encouraged by innumerable hells, which the law in vain strove to put down. Nightly raids were made upon them. In the same number of the Gentleman's Magazine as that just quoted, it is recorded that "the High Constable of Holborn searched a notorious gaming house behind Gray's Inn Road, but the gamesters were fled, only the keeper was arrested and bound over for £200." Again, I find in Wade's Chronology that "Justice Fielding, having received information of a rendezvous of gamesters in the Strand, procured a strong party of the Guards, who seized 45 of the tables, which they broke to pieces, and carried the gamesters before the justice. Under each of the broken tables were observed 2 iron rollers and 2 private springs, which those who were in the secret could touch and stop the turning whenever they had flats to deal with." No wonder these establishments throve. They were systematically organized, and administered by duly appointed officers. There was the commissioner, who checked the week's accounts and pocketed the takings; a director to superintend the room; an operator to deal the cards; and 4 to 5 croupiers, who watched the cards and gathered in the money of the bank. Besides these, there were "puffs," who had money given them to decoy people to play; a clerk and a squib, who were spies upon the straight dealings of the puffs; a flasher to swear how often the bank was stripped; a dunner to recover sums lost; a waiter to snuff candles and fill in the wine; and an attorney or Newgate solicitor. A flash captain was kept to fight gentlemen who were peevish about losing their money. At the door was a porter, generally a soldier of the Foot Guards, who admitted visitors after satisfying himself that they were of the right sort. The porter had aides de camp and assistants; an orderly man, who patrolled the street and gave notice of the approaching constables; a runner, who watched for the meetings of the justices and brought intelligence of the constables being out; and a host of link boys, coachmen, chairmen, drawers to assist, with common bail affidavit men, ruffians, bravos, and assassins for any odd job that might turn up, requiring physical strength. As the years passed the vice grew in magnitude. Large fortunes were made by the proprietors of gaming houses, thanks to the methodized employment of capital, invested regularly as in any other trading establishment, the invention of E.O. tables, and the introduction of the foreign games of roulette and rouge et noir. Little short of 1,000,000 must have been amassed in this way, individuals having acquired from £10,000 to £100,000 apiece. The number of the gambling establishments daily multiplied. They were mounted regardless of expense. Open house was kept, and free luxurious dinners laid for all comers. Merchants and bankers' clerks entrusted with large sums were especially encouraged to attend. The cost of entertainment in one house alone was £8,000 for 8 months, while the total expenditure on all as much as £150,000 a year. The gambling house keepers, often prize fighters originally, or partners admitted for their skill in card sharping or cocking dice, possessed such ample funds that they laughed at legal prosecutions. Witnesses were suborned, officers of justice bribed, informers intimidated. Armed ruffians and bludgeon men were employed to barricade the houses, and resist the civil power. Private competed with public hells. Great ladies of fashion, holding their heads high in the social world, made their drawing rooms into gambling places, into which young men of means were enticed and despoiled. This was called pigeoning, probably the first use of the expression. The most noted female gamesters were Lady Buckinghamshire, Lady Archer, Lady Mount Edgecombe, a trio who had earned for themselves the sobriquet of Furrow's Daughters. Their conduct came under severe reprehension of Lord Kenyon, who, in summing up a gambling case, warned them that if they came before him in connection with gambling transactions, though they should be the first ladies of the land, they should certainly exhibit themselves in the pillory. This well-merited threat was reproduced in various caricatures of the day, under such heads as "Ladies of elevated rank," "Pharaoh's Daughters, beware," "Discipline à la Kenyon." The Government itself was in a measure responsible for the diffusion of the passion for gambling. The pernicious custom of public lotteries practically legalized this baneful vice. State lotteries began in the reign of Elizabeth, and existed down to 1826. They brought in a considerable revenue, but they did infinite mischief by developing the rage for speculation, which extended to the whole community. The rich could purchase whole tickets, or great goes, For the more impecunious, the tickets were subdivided into "little goes." Those who had no tickets at all could still gamble at the lottery insurance offices by backing any particular number to win. The demoralization was widespread. It reached a climax in the South Sea Bubble, when thousands and thousands were first decoyed, then cruelly deceived and beggared. But lotteries lingered on till the government at length awoke to the degradation of obtaining an income from such a source. While crime thus stalked rampant through the land, the law was nearly powerless to grapple and check it. It had practically but one method of repression, the wholesale removal of convicted offenders to another world. Prevention, as we understand it, had not yet been invented. The metropolis, with its ill-paved, dimly lighted streets, was without police protection beyond that afforded by a few feeble watchmen, the sorely tried and often nearly useless Charlies. The administration of justice was defective. The justices had not sufficient powers, they were frequently as regardless of the law as ignorant of it, or else were defied by pettifoggers and people with money in their pockets. A mob of chairmen or servants, or a gang of thieves, were almost too big for the civil authority to repress, and the civil power generally, according to Fielding, was in a lethargic state. The private enterprise of citizens had sought for some time past to second the efforts of the state, and various societies for the reformation of manners laboured hard, but scarcely with marked success, to reduce crime. The first of these societies originated in the previous century, by 6 private gentlemen, whose hearts were moved by the dismal and desperate state of the country to engage in the difficult and dangerous enterprise, and it was soon strengthened by the addition of persons of eminency in the law, members of Parliament, justices of the peace, and considerable citizens of London of known abilities and great integrity. There was a second society of about 50 persons, tradesmen and others, and a third society of constables who met to consider how they might best discharge their oaths, a fourth to give information, while other bodies of householders and officers assisted in the great work. These in one year, 1724, had prosecuted over 2500 persons, and in the 33 years preceding nearly 90,000, while in the same period they have given away 400,000 good books. However well meant were these efforts, it is to be feared that they were of little avail in stemming the torrent of crime which long continued to deluge the country. The character of offences perpetrated will best be understood by passing from the general to the particular, and briefly indicating the salient points of a certain number of typical cases, all of which were in some way or other connected with Newgate. Crime was confined to no one class. While the lowest robbed with brutal violence, members of the highest stabbed and murdered each other on flimsy pretences, or found funds for debauchery in systematic and cleverly contrived frauds. Life was held very cheap in those days. Every one with any pretensions carried a sword, and appealed to it on the slightest excuse or provocation. Murderous duels and affrays were of constant occurrence. So-called affairs of honour could only be washed out in blood. Sometimes it was a causeless quarrel in a club or coffee–house ending in a fatal encounter. Richard Savage, the poet, was tried for his life for a murder of this kind in 1727. In company with 2 friends, all 3 of them being the worse for drink, he forced his way into a private room in Robinson's coffee–house, near Charing Cross, occupied by another party carousing. One of Savage's friends kicked down the table without provocation. "What do you mean by that?" cried one side. "What do you mean?" cried the other. Swords were drawn, and a fight ensued. Savage, who found himself in front of one Sinclair, made several thrusts at his opponent, and ran him through the body. Lights were put out, and Savage tried to escape, but was captured in a back court. He and his associates were committed first to the Gatehouse, and thence to Newgate. 3 weeks later they were arraigned at the Old Bailey, found guilty of murder, and cast for death. The king's pardon was, however, obtained for Savage through the intercession of influential friends, but contrary, it is said, to the expressed wish of his mother. Savage was tried before Sir Francis Page, commonly known as the hanging judge. He afterwards admitted that he had been anxious to hang Savage. In his old age, when his health was inquired after, he is reported to have replied, "I keep hanging on, hanging on." Savage was the illegitimate child of the Countess of Macclesfield, the fruit of a guilty intrigue with Captain Richard Savage, afterwards Earl Rivers. Lady Macclesfield was divorced, and subsequently married Earl Rivers, but she conceived a violent hatred for the child, and only consented to settle an annuity of £50 upon him, when grown to man's estate, under threat of exposure in the first publication of Savage's poems. Savage, after his release from Newgate, retired into Wales, but he continued in very distressed circumstances, and being arrested for debt, lingered for the remainder of his days in Bristol gaol. The case of Major Oneby is still more typical of the times. He was a military officer who had served in Marlborough's wars, and not without distinction, although enjoying an evil reputation as a duellist. When the army lay in winter quarters at Bruges, he had been "out," and had killed his man. Again in Jamaica he had wounded an adversary who presently died. After the Peace of Utrecht Major Oneby was placed on half pay, and to eke out his narrow means he became a professional gambler, being seldom without cards and dice in his pocket. He was soon known as a swaggerer and a bully, with whom it was wisest not to quarrel. One night in 1727, however, he was at play in the Castle Tavern in Drury Lane, when a Mr. Gower and he fell out about a bet. Oneby threw a decanter at Gower, and Gower returned the fire with a glass. Swords were drawn, but at the interposition of others put up again. Gower was for making peace, but Oneby sullenly swore he would have the other's blood. When the party broke up, he called Gower into another room and shut the door. A clashing of swords was heard within. The waiter broke open the door, and the company rushed in to find Oneby holding up Gower with his left hand, having the sword in his right. Blood was seen streaming through Gower's waistcoat, and his sword lay upon the floor. Some one said to Oneby, "You have killed him," but the major replied, "No, I might have done if I would, but I have only frightened him," adding that if he had killed him in the heat of passion, the law would have been on his side. But his unfortunate adversary did actually die of his wound the following day, whereupon Major Oneby was apprehended and locked up in Newgate. He was tried the following month at the Old Bailey, but the jury could not decide as to the exact measure of the major's guilt, except that it was clear he had given the first provocation, while it was not denied he had killed the deceased. A special verdict was agreed to, and the case with its various points referred to the 12 judges. The prisoner, who had hoped to escape with a conviction of manslaughter, was remanded to Newgate, and remained there in the State side without judgment for the space of 2 years. Becoming impatient, he prayed the Court of King's Bench that counsel might be heard in his case, and he was accordingly brought into court before the Lord Chief Justice Raymond, when his counsel and those for the Crown were fully heard. The judge reserved his judgment till he had consulted his 11 brethren, but the major, elated at the ingenious arguments of his lawyer, fully counted upon speedy release. On his way back to gaol he entertained his friends at a handsome dinner given at the Crown and Anchor Tavern. He continued to carouse and live high in Newgate for several months more, little doubting the result of the judges' conference. They met after considerable delay in Serjeant's Inn Hall. Counsel was heard on both sides, and the pleadings lasted a whole day. A friend called in the evening and told him, when he was making merry over a bowl of punch, that 11 of the judges had decided against him. This greatly alarmed him. Next day the keeper of Newgate, Mr. Akerman, came to put irons on him, unless he was prepared to pay for a special keeper to occupy the same room. Oneby was indignant, but helpless. He felt the ground slipping from under his feet, and he was almost prepared for the judgment delivered in open court that he had been guilty of murder, his threat that he would have Gower's blood having had great weight in his disfavour. Oneby spent the days before execution in 1729 in fruitless efforts to get relations and friends to use their influence in obtaining pardon for him. But he was so overbearing that his relations would not visit him in Newgate, and his friends, if he had any, would not stir a finger to help him. His last moments seem to have been spent between laughing at the broad jokes of his personal gaoler, who now never left him, one John Hooper, afterwards public executioner, and fits of rage against those who had deserted him in his extremity. He was further exasperated by a letter from an undertaker in Drury Lane, who, having heard that the Major was to die on the following Monday, promised to perform the funeral as cheap and in as decent a manner as any man alive. Another cause of annoyance was the publication of a broadsheet entitled "The Weight of Blood, or the Case of Major John Oneby," the writer of which had visited the prisoner ostensibly to offer to suppress the publication, but really as an interviewer to obtain some additional facts for his catchpenny pamphlet. The Major was so indignant that he laid a trap for the author by inviting him to revisit Newgate, promising himself the pleasure of thrashing him when he appeared, but the man declined to be caught. On the Saturday night before execution, Oneby, learning that a petition had been presented and rejected, prepared to die. He slept soundly till 4 in the morning, then, calling for a glass of brandy and writing materials, he wrote his will. It was brief, and to the following effect: "Cousin Turvill, give Akerman for the turnkey below stairs half a guinea, and Jack Hooper, who waits in my room, 5 shillings. The poor devils have had a great deal of trouble with me since I have been here." After this he begged to be left to sleep, but a friend called about 7. The Major cried feebly to his servant, "Philip, who is that?" and it was found that he was bleeding to death from a deep gash in his wrist. He was dead before a surgeon could be called in. In these disastrous affrays both antagonists were armed, but reckless roisterers and swaggering bobadils were easily provoked, and they did not hesitate, in a moment of mad passion, to use their swords upon defenceless men. Bailiffs and the lesser officers of justice were especially obnoxious to these high-tempered bloods. I read in Luttrell, under date February 1698, "Captain Dancy of the Guards killed a bailiff in Exeter Street, and is committed to Newgate." Again, in 1705, "Captain Carleton, formerly a justice of the peace for Middlesex, is committed to Newgate for running a marshal's man through the body, who endeavoured to arrest him on the parade by the Horse Guards in St. James's Park, of which wound it is thought the man will die." I can find no mention of the fate which overtook these murderers, but the calendars contain a detailed account of another murder of much the same kind, that perpetrated by the Marquis de Paleotti upon his servant John Nicolo, otherwise John the Italian, in 1718. The Marquis had come to England to visit his sister, who had married the Duke of Shrewsbury in Rome, and had launched out into a career of wild extravagance. The Duchess had paid his debts several times, but at length declined to assist him further. He was arrested and imprisoned, but his sister privately procured his discharge. After his enlargement, being without funds, the Marquis sent Nicolo to borrow what he could, but "the servant having met with frequent denials, declined going, at which the Marquis drew his sword and killed him on the spot." The Marquis seems to have hoped to have found sanctuary at the Bishop of Salisbury's, to whose house he repaired as soon as Nicolo's body was found. But he was arrested there, after having behaved so rudely that his sword, all bloody with gore, had to be taken from him, and he was conveyed to Newgate. His defence was weak, his guilt clear, and much to his surprise he was sentenced to be hanged. He declared that it was disgraceful "to put a nobleman to death like a common malefactor for killing a servant." But his plea availed little, and he suffered at Tyburn 5 weeks after the murder. 40 years later an English nobleman, Earl Ferrers, paid the same extreme penalty for murdering his steward. His lordship was tried by his peers, and after sentence, until his execution, was lodged in the Tower and not in Newgate. His case is sufficiently well known, and has already been briefly referred to. Another aristocratic miscreant, whose crimes only fell short of murder, was Colonel Francis Charteris. Well born, well educated, well introduced into life, he joined the army under Marlborough in the Low Countries as a cornet of horse, and soon became noted as a bold and dexterous gambler. His greed and rapacity were unbounded. He lent money at usurious rates to those whom he had already despoiled of large sums by foul play, and having thus ruined many of his brother officers, he was brought to trial, found guilty of disgraceful conduct, and sentenced by court martial to be cashiered. On his way back to Scotland, by falsely swearing he had been robbed at an inn, he swindled the landlord out of a large sum of money, as an indemnity, and does not seem to have been called to account for his fraud. In spite of his antecedents, Charteris obtained a new commission through powerful friends, and was soon advanced to the grade of colonel. Moving in the best society, he extended his gambling operations, and nearly robbed the Duchess of Queensberry of £3000 by placing her near a mirror, so that he could see all her cards. Escaping punishment for this, he continued his depredations till he acquired a considerable fortune and several landed estates. Fate overtook him at last, and he became the victim of his own profligacy. Long notorious as an unprincipled and systematic seducer, he effected the ruin of numbers by means of stratagems and bribes, but was at length arrested on a charge of criminal assault. He lay in Newgate on the State side, lightly ironed, and enjoying the best of the prison until the trial at the Old Bailey in February 1730. He was convicted and sentenced to die, but through the strenuous exertions of his son-in-law, the Earl of Wemyss, obtained the king's pardon. He died 2 years later, miserably, in Edinburgh, whither he had retired after his release. He was long remembered with obloquy. Dr. Arbuthnot, who wrote his epitaph, has best depicted his detestable character as a villain, "who with an inflexible constancy and inimitable impunity of life persisted, in spite of age and infirmity, in the practice of every human vice except prodigality and hypocrisy, his insatiable avarice exempting him from the first, and his matchless impudence from the latter; and who, having done every day of his life something worthy of a gibbet, was once condemned to one for what he had not done." Dr. Arbuthnot appears from this to have dissented from the verdict of the jury by which Charteris was tried. In times of such general corruption it was not strange that a deplorable laxity of morals should prevail as regards trusts, whether public or private. Even a Lord Chancellor was found guilty of venal practices, the sale of offices, and the misappropriation of funds lodged in the Chancery Court. This was the 12th Earl of Macclesfield, who sought thus dishonestly to mend his fortunes, impaired, it was said, by the South Sea bubble speculations. He was tried before his peers, found guilty, and declared for ever incapable of sitting in Parliament, or withholding any office under the Crown, and further sentenced to a fine of £30,000, with imprisonment in the Tower until it was paid. Lord Macclesfield promptly paid his fine, which was but a small part of the money he had amassed by his speculations, and was discharged, "to the disgrace of the times in which he lived," says the biographer of Lord Hardwicke. "The infamy with which he had been thus covered debarred him neither from the favour of the great nor even from that of his sovereign." Various cases of embezzlement by public officials previous to this are mentioned by Luttrell. Frauds upon the Exchequer and upon persons holding Government annuities were not infrequent. The first entry in Luttrell is dated 1697, May, and is to the effect that "Mr. Marriott, an under–teller in the Exchequer, arrested for altering an Exchequer bill for £10 to £100, pleaded innocency, but is sent to Newgate." Others were implicated, and a proclamation was issued offering a reward for the apprehension of Domingo Ortumez, a Portuguese, Robert Marriott, and another for counterfeiting Exchequer bills. A little later another teller, Mr. Darby, is sent to Newgate on a similar charge, and in that prison Mr. Marriott "accuses John Knight, Esquire, MP, Treasurer of Customs, who is displaced." Marriott's confession follows: "He met Mr. Burton and Mr. Knight at Somerset House, where they arranged to get 20 per cent. by making Exchequer bills specie bills. They offered Marriott £500 a year to take all upon himself if discovered. It is thought greater people are in it to destroy the credit of the nation." Following this confession, bills were brought into the House of Commons charging Burton, Knight, and Duncombe with embezzlement, but "blanks are left for the House to insert the punishment, which is to be either fine, imprisonment, or loss of estates." Knight was found guilty of endorsing Exchequer bills falsely, but not of getting money thereby. Burton was found guilty. Duncombe's name is not mentioned, and Marriott was discharged. But this does not end the business. In the May following, "Mr. Ellers, master of an annuity office in the Exchequer, was committed to Newgate for forging people's hands to their orders, and receiving a considerable sum of money thereon." Again, in October, "Bellingham, an old offender, was convicted of felony in forging Exchequer bills, and a Mrs. Butler also for forging a bond of £20,000 payable by the executors of Sir Robert Clayton 6 years after his death." Later on (1708) I find an entry in Luttrell that Justice Dyot, who was a commissioner of the Stamp Office, was committed to Newgate for counterfeiting stamps, which others whom he informed against distributed. Of the same character as the foregoing was the offence of Mr. Lemon, a clerk in the Pell Office of the Exchequer, who received £300 in the name of a gentlewoman deceased, and kept it, for which he was turned out of his place. Other unfaithful public servants were to be found in other departments. Robert Lowther, Esquire, was taken into custody on the 25th of October, 1721, by order of the Privy Council, for his tyrannical and corrupt administration when governor of the island of Barbadoes. 20 years later, the House of Commons fly at still higher game, and commit the Solicitor of the Treasury to Newgate for refusing to answer questions put to him by the secret committee which sat to inquire into Sir Robert Walpole's administration. This official had often been charged with the Prime Minister's secret disbursements, and he was accused of being recklessly profuse. End of Section 13.
Section 14 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1 by Arthur Griffiths. Section 14. Later Records. Returning to meaner and more commonplace offenders, I find in the records full details of all manner of crimes. Murders the most atrocious and bloodthirsty, robberies executed with great ingenuity and boldness by both sexes, remarkable instances of swindling and successful frauds, early cases of forgery, coining carried out with extensive ramifications, piracies upon the high seas, long practised with strange immunity from reprisals. Perhaps the most revolting murder ever perpetrated, not excepting those of later date, was that in which Catherine Hayes assisted. The victim was her husband, an unoffending, industrious man, whose life she made miserable, boasting once indeed that she would think it no more sin to murder him than to kill a dog. After a violent quarrel between them, she persuaded a man who lodged with them, named Billings, and who was either her lover or her illegitimate son, to join her in an attempt upon Hayes. A new lodger, Wood, arriving, it was necessary to make him a party to the plot, but he long resisted Mrs. Hayes' specious arguments, till she clenched them by declaring that Hayes was an atheist and a murderer, whom it could be no crime to kill. Moreover, that at his death she would become possessed of £1,500, which she would hand over to Wood. Wood at last yielded, and after some discussion it was decided to do the dreadful deed while Hayes was in his cups. After a long drinking bout, in which Hayes drank wine, probably drugged, and the rest beer, the victim dragged himself to bed and fell on it in a stupor. Billings now went in, and with a hatchet struck Hayes a violent blow on the head, and fractured his skull. Then Wood gave the poor wretch, as he was not quite dead, 2 more blows, and finished him. The next job was to dispose of the murdered man's remains. To evade identification, Catherine Hayes suggested that the head should be cut off, which Wood effected with his pocket-knife. She then proposed to boil it, but this was overruled, and the head was disposed of by the men, who threw it into the Thames, from a wharf near the Horse Ferry at Westminster. They hoped that the damning evidence would be carried off by the next tide, but it remained floating near shore, and was picked up next day by a watchman and handed over to the parish officers, by whom, when washed and the hair combed, it was placed on the top of a pole in the churchyard of St. Margaret's, Westminster. Having got rid of the head, the murderers next dealt with the body, which they dismembered and packed the parts into a box. This was conveyed to Marylebone, where the pieces were taken out, wrapped in an old blanket, and sunk in a pond. Meanwhile, the exposed head had been viewed by curious crowds, and at last a Mr. Bennet, an organ-builder, saw a resemblance to the face of Hayes, with whom he had been acquainted. Another person, a journeyman tailor, also recognized it, and inquiries were made of Catherine as to her husband. At first she threw people off the scent by confessing that Hayes had killed a man and absconded, but being questioned by several, she told a different story to each, and presently suspicion fell upon her. As it had come out that Billings and Wood had been drinking with Hayes the last time he was seen, they were included in the warrant, which was now issued for the apprehension of the murderers. The woman was arrested by Mr. Justice Lambert in person, who had procured the assistance of 2 officers of the Life Guards, and Billings with her. One was committed to the Bridewell, Tothill Fields, the other to the Gatehouse. Catherine's conduct, when brought into the presence of her murdered husband's head, almost passes belief. Taking the glass bottle in which it had been preserved into her arms, she cried, "It is my dear husband's head," and shed tears as she embraced it. The surgeon having taken the head out of the case, she kissed it rapturously, and begged to be indulged with a lock of his hair. Next day, the trunk and remains of the corpse were discovered at Marylebone without the head, and the justices, nearly satisfied as to the guilt of Catherine Hayes, committed her to Newgate. Wood was soon after captured, and on hearing that the body had been found, confessed the whole crime. Billings shortly did the same, but Mrs. Hayes obstinately refused to admit her guilt. This atrocious creature was for the moment the centre of interest. Numbers visited her in Newgate, and sought to learn her reasons for committing so dreadful a crime, but she gave different and evasive answers to all. At her trial she pleaded hard to be exempted from the penalty of petty treason, which was at that time burning, alleging that she was not guilty of striking the fatal blow. The crime of petty treason was established when any person out of malice took away the life of another to whom he or she owed special obedience, as when a servant killed his master, a wife her husband, or an ecclesiastic his superior. The wife's accomplices in the murder of a husband were not deemed guilty of petty treason. She was told the law must take its course. Billings and Wood hoped they might not be hung in chains, but received no answer. Wood actually died in prison before execution. Billings suffered at Tyburn, and was hung in chains near the pond in Marylebone. Mrs. Hayes tried to destroy herself, but failed, and was literally burnt alive. The fire reaching the hands of the hangman, he let go the rope by which she was to have been strangled, and the flames slowly consumed her, as she pushed the blazing faggots from her, and rent the air with her agonized cries. Her execution, which took place on 9th May 1726, was not the last of its kind. In November 1750, Amy Hutchinson was burned at Ely, after a conviction of petty treason, having poisoned a husband newly married, whom she had taken to spite a truant lover. In 1767, again, Anne Sowerly underwent the same awful sentence at York. She also had poisoned her husband. Last of all, on the 10th of March 1788, a woman was burnt before the debtors' door of Newgate. Having been tied to a stake and seated on a stool, the stool was withdrawn and she was strangled. After that she was burnt. Her offence was coining. In the following year, 1789, an act was passed which abolished this cruel custom of burning women for petty treason. Sarah Malcolm was another female monster, a wholesale murderess, whose case stands out as one of particular atrocity even in those bloodthirsty times. She was employed as a laundress in the Temple, where she waited on several gentlemen, and had also access in her capacity of charwoman to the chambers occupied by an aged lady named Mrs. Duncombe. Footnote. As barristers often preferred to do business at their own homes, chambers in the Temple were rather at a discount just then, and their landlords, preferring tenants of no legal skill to no tenants at all, let them out to any that offered. Consequently, many private people creep about the inns of the court. Newgate Calendar, 1 470. End of footnote. Sarah's cupidity was excited by the chance sight of her mistress's hoarded wealth, both in silver plate and broad coins, and she resolved to become possessed of it, hoping, when enriched, to gain a young man of her acquaintance named Alexander as her husband. Mrs. Duncombe had 2 other servants, Elizabeth Harrison, also aged, and a young maid named Anne Price, who resided with her in the Temple. One day, February 2nd, 1733, a friend coming to call upon Mrs. Duncombe was unable to gain admittance. After some delay the rooms were broken into, and the 3 occupants were found barbarously murdered, the girl Price in the first room, with her throat cut from ear to ear, her hair loose, hanging over her eyes, and her hands clenched. In the next lay Elizabeth Harrison on a press bed, strangled, and last of all, old Mrs. Duncombe, also lying across her bed, quite dead. The strong box had been broken open and rifled. That same night one of the barristers, returning to his chambers late, found Sarah Malcolm there kindling a fire, and after remarking upon her appearance at that strange hour, bade her begone, saying that no person acquainted with Mrs. Duncombe should be in his chambers till the murderer was discovered. Before leaving she confessed to having stolen 2 of his waistcoats, whereupon he called the watch and gave her into custody. After her departure, assisted by a friend, the barrister made a thorough search of his rooms, and in a cupboard came upon a lot of linen stained with blood, also a silver tankard with blood upon the handle. The watchman had suffered Sarah to go at large, but she was forthwith rearrested. On searching her, a green silk purse containing 21 counters was found upon her, and she was committed to Newgate. There, on arrival, she sought to hire the best accommodation, offering 2 or 3 guineas for a room upon the master debtor's side. Roger Johnston, a turnkey, upon this, searched her, and discovered, concealed under her hair, no doubt in a species of chignon, a bag containing 20 moidores, 18 guineas, and a number of other broad pieces. This money, she confessed, had come from Mrs. Duncombe, but she stoutly denied all complicity with the murder, or that she had done more than contrive the robbery. She charged 2 brothers named Alexander, one the man she desired to marry, and a woman, Mary Tracy, with the greater crime. Upon her information they were arrested and confronted with her. She persisted in this line of defence at her trial, but the circumstantial evidence against her was so strong that the jury at once found her guilty. She herself had but little hope of escape, and had been heard to cry out on her first commitment, "I am a dead woman." She was duly executed at Tyburn. The Alexanders and Tracy were discharged. I have specially instanced these foul murders as exhibiting circumstances of atrocity rarely equalled in the records of crime. Catherine Hayes and Sarah Malcolm were unsexed desperadoes, whose misdeeds throw into the shade those of the Mannings and Kate Websters of later times. But women had no monopoly of assassination, in those days when life was held so cheap. Male murderers were still more numerous, and also more pitiless and bloodthirsty. The calendars are replete with homicides, and to refer to them in anything like detail would both weary and disgust the reader. I shall do no more, therefore, than briefly indicate here a certain number of the more prominent cases, remarkable either from the position of the criminals, the ties by which they were bound to their victims, or the horrible character of the crime. The hangman figures among the murderers of this epoch. John Price, who filled the office in 1718, and who rejoiced in the usual official sobriquet of Jack Ketch, was a scoundrel rendered still more callous and cruel by his dreadful calling. He had begun life well as an apprentice, but he absconded, and entering the navy, served with credit on board different king's ships for 18 years. On his discharge, seeking employment, he obtained the situation of public executioner. He might have lived decently on the hangman's wages and perquisites, but he was a spendthrift who soon became acquainted with the interiors of the debtors' prisons for Middlesex. Once he was arrested on his way back from Tyburn after a good day's work, having in his possession, besides fees, the complete suits of 3 men who had just been executed. He gave up all this to liquidate the debt, but the value being insufficient, he was lodged in the Marshalsea. When released in due course, he returned to his old employment, but was soon arrested again, and on a serious charge, that of a murderous assault upon a poor woman who sold gingerbread through the streets. He had shamefully attacked her, and, maddened by her resistance, had ill-used her terribly. He beat her so cruelly, the account says, that streams of blood issued from her eyes and mouth. He broke one of her arms, knocked out some of her teeth, bruised her head in a most shameful manner, and forced one of her eyes from the socket. One account says that he was taken red-handed close to the scene of his guilt. Another, the more probable, that he was arrested on his way to Tyburn with a convict for the gallows. In any case, his unfortunate victim had just life in her to bear testimony against him. Price was committed to Newgate and tried for his life. His defence was that in crossing Moorfields he found something lying in his way, which he kicked and found to be the body of a woman. He lifted her up, but she could not stand on her legs. The evidence of others was too clear, and the jury did not hesitate to convict. After sentence, he abandoned himself to drink, and obstinately refused to confess. But on the day before his execution he acknowledged that he had committed the crime while in a state of intoxication. He was hanged in Bunhill Fields, and his body afterwards exhibited in chains in Holloway, near the scene of the murder. Wife murder was of common occurrence in these reckless times. The disgraceful state of the marriage laws, and the facility with which the matrimonial knot could be tied, often tempted unscrupulous people to commit bigamy. Footnote: Beau Fielding, who was tried at the Old Bailey in 1706 for committing bigamy with the Duchess of Cleveland, is one of the most remarkable instances of this. See Celebrated Trials, 3, 534. Also see the trial of the Duchess of Kingston, Remarkable Trials, 203. She was tried by the House of Lords, found guilty, but pleaded her peerage and was discharged. End footnote. Louis Houssart was of French extraction, settled in England, who married Anne Rondeau at the French church in Spitalfields. After about 3 years he left his wife with disgust, and going into the city, passed himself off as a single man. Becoming acquainted with a Mrs. Hearn, he presently married her. He had not been long married before his new wife taxed him with having another wife. He swore it was false, and offered to take the sacrament upon it. She appeared satisfied, and begged him to clear his reputation. "Do not be uneasy," he said. "In a little while I will make you sensible I have no other wife." He now resolved to make away with the first Mrs. Louis Houssart, otherwise Anne Rondeau, and reopened communications with her. Finding her in ill health, one day he brought her a medicine which had the appearance of conserve of roses, which threw her into such severe convulsive fits that her life was despaired of for some hours, but at length she recovered. This attempt having failed, he tried a simpler plan. Dressed in a white coat, with a sword and cane, he went one evening to the end of Swan Alley, where his wife lived with her mother, and finding a boy, gave him a penny to go and tell Mrs. Rondeau that a gentleman wanted to speak to her in a neighbouring public-house. When she left the house, Houssart went in, found his wife alone, and cut her throat with a razor. Thus murdered, she was found by her mother on her return, after inquiring in vain for the gentleman who was said to be waiting for her. Suspicion fell on Houssart, who was arrested and tried, but for want of the boy's evidence acquitted of the murder. But he was detained in Newgate to take his trial for bigamy. While waiting sentence, the boy, a lad of 13, who knew of the murder and arrest, and who thought he would be hanged if he confessed that he had carried the message to Mrs. Rondeau, came forward to give evidence. He was taken to Newgate into a room, and identified Houssart at once among 7 or 8 others. The brother of the deceased, Solomon Rondeau, as heir, now lodged an appeal, in the names of John Doe and Richard Roe, an ancient form of legal procedure, against Houssart, who was eventually again brought to trial. Various pleas were put forward by the defence in bar of further proceedings, among others that there were no such persons as John Doe and Richard Roe. But this plea with the rest was overruled, the fact being sworn to that there was a John Doe in Middlesex, a weaver, also a Richard Roe, who was a soldier, and the trial went on. The boy's evidence was very plain. He remembered Houssart distinctly, had seen him by the light of a lantern at a butcher's shop. He wore a whitish coat. The boy also recognized Mrs. Rondeau as the woman to whom he gave the message. Others swore to the white coat which Houssart had on, but the most damning evidence was that of a friend whom he had summoned to see him in Newgate, and whom he asked to swear that they had been drinking together in Newgate Street at the time the murder was committed. Houssart offered this witness a new shirt, a new suit of clothes, and 20 guineas to swear for him. The prisoner, however, owned that he did give the boy a penny to call the woman out, and that he then went in and gave his wife a touch with the razor, but did not think of killing her. The prisoner was found guilty and hanged at the end of Swannyard in Shoreditch. Vincent Davis was another miscreant who murdered his wife under much the same conditions. He had long barbarously ill-used her. He kept a small walking cane on purpose to beat her with, and at last so frightened her by his threats to kill her that she ran away from him. She returned one night, but finding that he had put an open knife by the bedside, she placed herself under the protection of the landlady, who advised her to swear the peace against him and get him imprisoned. Next day the brutal husband drove her out of the house, declaring she had no right to be in his company, as he was married to little Jenny. But she implored him to be friends, and having followed him to an alehouse seeking reconciliation, he so slashed her fingers with a knife that she came back with bleeding hands. That same night, when his wife met him on his return home, he ordered her to light him to his room, then, drawing his knife, stabbed her in the breast. The poor woman bled to death in half an hour. Davis, after the deed was done, was seized with contrition, and when arrested and on his way to Newgate, he told the peace officer that he had killed the best wife in the world. "I know I shall be hanged," he added, "but for God's sake don't let me be anatomized." This man is said to have assumed an air of bravado while he lay under sentence of death, but his courage deserted him as the time for execution approached. He had such a dread of falling into the hands of the surgeons that he wrote to several friends begging them to rescue his body if any attempt should be made at the gallows to remove it. He was hanged at Tyburn on the 30th of April, 1725, but the calendar does not state what happened to his corpse. George Price, who murdered his wife in 1738, had an analogous motive. He wished to release himself from one tie in order to enter into another. He was in service in Kent, his wife lived in lodgings in Highgate, and their family increased far more rapidly than he liked. Having for some time paid his addresses to a widow in Kent, he at length resolved to remove the only obstacle to a second and more profitable marriage. With this infernal object in view, he went to Highgate, and told his wife that he had secured a place for her at Putney, to which he would himself drive her in a chaise. She was warned by some of his fellow servants against trusting herself alone with him, but she said she had no fear of him, as he had treated her with unusual kindness. They drove off towards Hounslow. On the way, she begged him to stop while she bought some snuff, but he refused, laughingly declaring that she would never want to use snuff again. When they reached Hounslow Heath, it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. The time and place being suitable, he suddenly threw his whip-lash round his wife's throat and drew it tight. As the cord was not quite in the right place, he coolly altered it, and disregarding her entreaties, he again tightened the rope. Then, finding she was not quite dead, pulled it with such violence that it broke, but not till the murder was accomplished. Having stripped the body, he disfigured it, as he hoped, beyond recognition, then left it under a gibbet on which some malefactors were hanging in chains, and returned to London with his wife's clothes, part of which he dropped around the street, and part he gave back to her landlady, to whom they belonged. Being seen about, so many inquiries were made for his wife that he feared detection, and fled to Portsmouth. Next day He heard the murder cried through the streets by the bellman, and found that it was his own case, with an exact description of his appearance. He at once jumped out of the window (the inn was by the waterside) and swam to another part of the shore. Thence he made his way into the country, and got chance jobs as a farm labourer. At Oxford he found that he was advertised in the local paper, and he again decamped, travelling on till he reached his own home in Wales. His father gave him refuge for a couple of days, but a report of his being in the house got about, and he had to fly to Gloucester, where he became an ostler at an inn. In Gloucester he was again recognized as the man who had killed his wife on Hounslow Heath, by a gentleman who promised not to betray him, but warned him that he would be taken into custody if he remained in town. Agitated by the momentary fear of detection, Price knew not how to act, and he resolved at length to go back to London, and give himself up to justice. He called first on his former master, was apprehended and committed to Newgate. He took his trial in due course, and was, on the strongest circumstantial evidence ever adduced against an offender, cast for death, but fell a victim to the jail fever in October 1738. Mention of two more heinous cases of wife murder may be made. The second marriage of Edward Joines, contracted at the Fleet, was not a happy one. His wife had a violent temper, and they continually disagreed. A daughter of hers lived with them, and the two women contrived to aggravate and annoy Joines to desperation. He retaliated by brutal treatment. On one occasion he pushed his wife into the grate and scorched her arm. Frequently he drove her out of doors in scanty clothing at late hours and in inclement weather. One day his anger was roused by seeing a pot of ale going into his house for his wife, who was laid up with a fractured arm. He rushed in, and after striking the tankard out of her hand, seized her by the bad arm, twisted it till the bone again separated. The fracture was reset, but mortification rapidly supervened, and she died within 10 days. The coroner's jury in consequence brought in a verdict of wilful murder against Joines. He was in due course convicted of murder, although it was difficult to persuade him that he had had a fair trial, seeing that his wife did not succumb immediately to the cruel injury she had received at his hands. In December 1739 he was executed. The second wife of John Williamson received still more terrible and inhumane treatment at his hands. This ruffian, within 3 weeks after his marriage, drenched his wife with cold water, and having otherwise ill-used her, inflicted the following diabolical torture. Having fastened her hands behind with handcuffs, he lifted her off the ground with her toes barely touching it, by a rope run through a staple. She was locked up in a closet, and close by was placed a small piece of bread and butter, which she could just touch with her lips. She was allowed a small portion of water daily. Sometimes a girl who was in the house gave the poor creature a stool to rest her feet on, but Williamson discovered it, and was so furious that he nearly beat the girl to death. The wretched woman was kept in this awful plight for more than a month at a time, and at length succumbed. She died raving mad. Williamson, when arrested, made a frivolous defence, declaring his wife provoked him by treading on a kitten and killing it. In 1760 he was found guilty and executed. The victim of Theodore Gardelle was a woman, although not his wife. This murder much exercised the public mind at the time. The perpetrator was a foreigner, a hitherto inoffensive miniature painter, who was goaded into such a frenzy by the intolerable irritation of the woman's tongue, that he first struck and then dispatched her. He lodged with a Mrs. King in Leicester Fields, whose miniature he had painted, but not very successfully. She had desired to have the portrait particularly good, and in her disappointment gave the unfortunate painter no peace. One morning she came into the parlour which he used, and which was en suite with her bedroom, and immediately attacked him about the miniature. Provoked by her insults, Gardelle told her she was a very impertinent woman, at which she struck him a violent blow on the chest. He pushed her from him, rather in contempt than anger, as he afterwards declared, and with no desire to hurt her. Her foot caught in the floor-cloth, she fell backward, and her head came with great force against the sharp corner of the bedstead, for Gardelle apparently had followed her into her bedroom. The blood immediately gushed from her mouth, and he at once ran up to assist her and express his concern, but she pushed him away, threatening him with the consequences of his act. He was greatly terrified at the thought of being charged with a criminal assault, but the more he strove to pacify, the more she reviled and threatened, till at last he seized a sharp-pointed ivory comb which lay upon her toilet-table, and drove it into her throat. The blood poured out in still greater volume, and her voice gradually grew fainter and fainter, and she presently expired. Gardelle said afterwards he drew the bedclothes over her, then, horrified and overcome, fell by her side in a swoon. When he came to himself he examined the body to see if Mrs. King were quite dead, and in his confusion staggered against the wainscot and hid his head so as to raise a great bump over his eye. Gardelle now seems to have considered with himself how best he might conceal his crime. There was only one other resident in the house, a maidservant, who was out on a message for him at the time of his fatal quarrel with Mrs. King. When she returned she found the bedroom locked, and Gardelle told her her mistress had gone into the country for the day. Later on he paid her wages on behalf of Mrs. King and discharged her, with the explanation that her mistress intended to bring home a new maid with her. Having now the house to himself, he entered the chamber of death and stripped the body, which he laid in the bed. He next disposed of the blood-stained bedclothes by putting them to soak in a wash-tub in the back wash-house. A servant of an absent fellow-lodger came in late and asked for Mrs. King, but Gardelle said she had not returned, and that he meant to sit up for her and let her into the house. Next morning he explained Mrs. King's absence by saying she had come late and gone off again for the day. This went on from Wednesday to Saturday, but no suspicion of anything wrong had as yet been conceived, and the body still lay in the same place in the back room. On Sunday Gardelle began to put into execution a project for destroying the body in parts, which he disposed of by throwing them down the sinks, or spreading in the cockloft. On Monday and Tuesday inquiries began to be made for Mrs. King, and Gardelle continued to say that he expected her daily, but on Thursday the stained bedclothes were found in the wash-tub. Gardelle was seen coming up from the wash-house, and was heard to ask what had become of the linen. This roused suspicion for the first time. The discharged maidservant was hunted up, and as she declared she knew nothing of the wash-tub or its contents, and as Mrs. King was still missing, the neighbours began to move in the matter. Mr. Barron, an apothecary, came and questioned Gardelle, who was so much confused in his answers that a warrant was obtained for his arrest. Then Mrs. King's bedroom was examined, and that of Gardelle, now a prisoner. In both were found conclusive evidence of foul play. By and by, in the cockloft and elsewhere, portions of the missing woman were discovered, and some jewellery known to be hers was traced to Gardelle, who did not long deny his guilt. When he was in the new prison in Clerkenwell he tried to commit suicide by taking 40 drops of opium, but it failed even to procure him sleep. After this he swallowed halfpence to the number of 12, hoping that the verdigris would kill him, but he survived after suffering great tortures. He was removed then to Newgate for greater security, and was closely watched till the end. After a fair trial he was convicted and cast for death. His execution took place in the Haymarket near Panton Street, to which he was led past Mrs. King's house, and at which he cast one glance as he passed. His body was hanged in chains on Hounslow Heath. End of section 14.
Section 15 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Chronicles of Newgate, Vol.1 by Arthur Griffiths. Later Records, Part 2. Women were as capable of fiendish cruelty as men, and displayed greater and more diabolical ingenuity in devising torments for their victims. 2 murders typical of this class of crime may be quoted here. One was that committed by the Meatyards mother and daughter upon an apprentice girl, the other that of Elizabeth Brownrigg, also on an apprentice. The Meatyards kept a millinery shop in Bruton Street, Berkeley Square, and had 5 parish apprentices bound to them. One was a sickly girl, Ann Taylor by name. Being unable to do as much work as her employers desired, they continually vented their spite upon her. After enduring great cruelty, Ann Taylor absconded. She was caught, brought back to Bruton Street, and imprisoned in a garret on bread and water. She again escaped, and was again recaptured and cruelly beaten with a broom handle. Then they tied her with a rope to the door of a room, so that she could neither sit nor lie down, and she was so kept for 3 successive days, but suffered to go to bed at night time. On the 3rd night she was so weak she could hardly creep upstairs. On the 4th day her fellow apprentices were brought to witness her torments as an incentive to exertion, but were forbidden to afford her any kind of relief. On this, the last day of her torture, she faltered in speech and presently expired. The meat yards now tried to bring their victim to with hartshorn, but finding life was extinct, they carried the body up to the garret and locked it in. Then 4 days later they enclosed it in a box, left the garret door ajar, and spread a report through their house that Nanny had once more absconded. The deceased had a sister, a fellow apprentice, who declared she was persuaded Nanny was dead, whereupon the meat yards also murdered the sister and secreted the body. Anne's body remained in the garret for a couple of months, when the stench of decomposition was so great that the murderesses feared detection, and after chopping the corpse in pieces, they burnt parts and disposed of others in drains and gully holes. 4 years elapsed without suspicion having been aroused, but there had been constant and violent quarrels between mother and daughter, the former frequently beating and ill-using the latter, who in return reviled her mother as a murderess. During this time the daughter left her home to live with a Mr. Rooker as servant at Ealing. Her mother followed her, and still behaved so outrageously that the daughter, in Mr. Rooker's presence, upbraided her with what they had done. He became uneasy, and cross-questioned them till they confessed the crime. Both women were arrested and tried at the Old Bailey, where they were convicted and sentenced to death. The mother on the morning of her execution was taken with a fit from which she never recovered, and she was in a state of insensibility when hanged. Elizabeth Brownrigg was the wife of a plumber, who carried on business in Flower de Luce Court, Fleet Street. She practised midwifery, and received parish apprentices, whom she took to save the expense of keeping servants. 2 girls, victims of her cruel ill-usage, ran away, but a third, Mary Clifford, bound to her by the parish of Whitefriars, remained to endure still worse. Her inhuman mistress repeatedly beat her, now with a hearth-broom, now with a horsewhip or a cane. The girl was forced to lie at nights in a coal-hole, with no bed but a sack and some straw. She was often nearly perished with cold. Once, after a long diet of bread and water, when nearly starved to death, she rashly broke into a cupboard in search of food, and was caught in the act. Mrs. Brownrigg, to punish her, made her strip, and while she was naked repeatedly beat her with the butt end of a whip. Then fastening a jack chain around her neck, she drew it as tight as possible without strangling, and sent her back to the coal-hole with her hands tied behind her back. Mrs. Brownrigg's son vied with his mother in ill-treating the apprentices, and when the mistress was tired of horsewhipping, the lad continued the savage punishment. When Mary Clifford complained to a French lodger of the barbarity she experienced, Mrs. Brownrigg flew at her and cut her tongue in 2 places with a pair of scissors. Other apprentices were equally ill-used, and they were all covered with wounds and bruises from the cruel flagellations they received. At length one of the neighbours, alarmed by the constant moaning and groanings which issued from Brownrigg's house, began to suspect that the apprentices were treated with unwarrantable severity. It was impossible to gain admission, but a maid looked through a skylight into a covered yard, and saw one of the apprentices, in a shocking state of filth and wretchedness, kept there with a pig. One of the overseers now went and demanded Mary Clifford. Mrs. Brownrigg produced another, Mary Mitchell, who was taken to the workhouse, but in such a pitiable state that in removing her clothes her bodice stuck to her wounds. Mary Mitchell, having been promised that she should not be sent back to Mrs. Brownrigg's, gave a full account of the horrid treatment she and Mary Clifford had received. A further search was made in the Brownrigg's house, but without effect. At length, under threat of removal to prison, Mrs. Brownrigg produced Clifford from a cupboard under a buffet in the dining-room. It is impossible, says the account, to describe the miserable appearance of this poor girl. Nearly her whole body was ulcerated. Her life was evidently in imminent danger. Having been removed to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, She died there within a few days. The man Brownrigg was arrested, but the woman and son made their escape, shifting their abode from place to place, buying new disguises from time to time at rag fairs. Eventually they took refuge in lodgings at Wandsworth, where they were recognized by their landlord as answering the description of the murderers of Mary Clifford, and arrested. Mrs. Brownrigg was tried and executed. The men, acquitted of the graver charge, were only sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. The story runs that Hogarth, who prided himself on his skill as a physiognomist, wished to see Mrs. Brownrigg in Newgate. The governor, Mr. Ackerman, admitted him, but at the instance of a mutual friend, played a trick upon the painter by bringing Mrs. Brownrigg before him casually, as some other woman. Hogarth, on looking at her, took Ackerman aside and said, "You must have 2 great female miscreants in your custody, for this woman, as well as Mrs. Brownrigg, is from her features capable of any cruelty and any crime." This story, although ben trovato, is apocryphal. At the time of this alleged visit to Newgate Hogarth was not alive. I pass now to murders of less atrocity, the result of temporary and more or less ungovernable passion, rather than of malice deliberate and aforethought. In this class we included the case of Mr. Plunkett, a young gentleman of Irish extraction, who murdered a peruke maker when asked an exorbitant price for a wig. Brown had made it to order for Mr. Plunkett, and wanted £7 for it. After haggling he reduced it to 6. Plunkett offered 4, and on this being refused, seized a razor lying handy and cut Brown's throat. A somewhat similar case was that of Mr. Edward Bird, a well-born youth, who had been educated at Eton, and after making the grand tour had received a commission in a regiment of horse. Unfortunately he led a wild, dissolute life, associating with low characters. One morning, after spending the night in a place of public resort, he ordered a bath. One waiter deputed the job to another. The latter went to Bird to apologize for the delay. Bird, growing furious, drew his sword, and made several passes at the waiter, who avoided them by holding the door in his hand, and then escaped downstairs. Bird pursued, threw the man down, breaking his ribs. On this, the master of the house and another waiter, by name Loxton, tried to appease Bird, but the latter, frantic at not having the bath when ordered, fell upon Loxton and ran him through with his sword. Loxton dropped and died almost instantaneously. Bird was arrested, committed to Newgate, and eventually tried for his life. He was convicted and received sentence of death, but great interest was made to get it commuted to transportation. His powerful friends might have obtained it but for the protests of Loxton's representatives, and Bird was ordered for execution. The night before he first tried poison, then stabbed himself in several places, but survived to be taken the following morning to Tyburn in a mourning coach, attended by his mother and the ordinary of Newgate. At the gallows he asked for a glass of wine and a pinch of snuff, which he took with apparent unconcern, wishing health to those who stood near him, and then repeated the Apostles' Creed, and was launched into eternity. The military were not over popular at times, when party disputes ran high, and the soldiery were often exposed to contumely in the streets. It must be admitted, too, that they were ready enough to accept any quarrel fastened upon them. Thus William Hawksworth, a guardsman, while marching through the park with a party to relieve guard at St. James, left the ranks to strike a woman who he thought had insulted his cloth. It was not she, however, but her companion who had cried, "What a stir there is about King George's soldiers!" This companion, by name Ransom, resented the blow, and called Hawksworth a puppy, whereupon the soldier clubbed his musket and knocked the civilian down. Hawksworth marched on with his guard. Ransom was removed to the hospital with a fractured skull, and died in a few hours, but a bystander, having learned the name of the offender, obtained a warrant against Hawksworth, who was committed to Newgate. He was ably defended at his trial, and his commanding officer gave him an excellent character. but the facts were so clearly proved that conviction was imperative. For some time he was buoyed up with the hope of reprieve, but this failed him at the last, and he went to Tyburn solemnly declaring that ransom hit him first, that he had no malice against the deceased, and he hardly remembered leaving the ranks to strike him. Two cases may well be inserted here, although belonging to a somewhat later date. Both were murders committed under the influence of strong excitement. One was the fierce outburst of passionate despair at unrequited love, the other the rash action of a quick-tempered man who was vested for the moment with absolute power. The first was the murder of Miss Ray by the Reverend James Hackman, the second the flogging to death of the Sergeant Armstrong by order of Colonel Wall, Lieutenant Governor of Goree. Mr. Hackman had held a commission in the 68th Foot, and while employed on the recruiting service at Huntingdon, had been hospitably received at Hinchingbroke, the seat of Lord Sandwich. At that time a Miss Ray resided there under the protection of his lordship, by whom she had had 9 children. Hackman fell desperately in love with Miss Ray, and the lady did not altogether reject his attentions. A correspondence between them, which bears every appearance of authenticity, was published after the murder under the title of Love and Madness, and the letters on both sides are full of ardent protestations. Hackman continued to serve for some time, but the exile from the sight of his beloved became so intolerable that he sold out, took orders, and entered the church, obtaining eventually the living of Wiverton in Norfolk. He had determined to marry Miss Ray if she would accept him, and one of the last letters of the correspondence above quoted proves that the marriage arrangements were all but completed. On the 1st March 1779 he writes, "In a month or 6 weeks at farthest from this time, I might certainly call you mine. Only remember that my character, now I have taken orders, renders exhibition necessary. By to-night's post I shall write into Norfolk about the alterations at our parsonage." But within a few weeks a cloud overshadowed his life. It is only vaguely indicated in a letter to a friend, dated the 20th March, in which he hints at a rupture between Miss Ray and himself. "What I shall do I know not. Without her I do not think I can exist." A few days later he wrote to the same friend, "Despair goads me on. Death only can relieve me. What then have I to do, who only lived when she loved me, but cease to live now she ceases to love?" At this period it is evident that the idea of suicide only occupied his overwrought brain. He wrote on the 7th April, "When this reaches you I shall be no more. You know where my affections were placed. My having by some means or other lost hers, an idea which I could not support, has driven me to madness." So far he does not appear to have contemplated any violence against Miss Ray, for in his letter he commends her to the kind offices of his friend. He spent that day in self-communing and in reading a volume of Dr. Blair's sermons. In the evening he went from his lodgings in Duke's Court, St. Martin's Lane, towards the Admiralty, and saw Miss Ray drive by to the Covent Garden Theatre. He followed her into the theatre and gazed at her for the last time. Then, unable to restrain the violence of his passion, he returned to his lodgings, and having loaded 2 pistols, returned to Covent Garden, where he waited in the piazza till the play was over. When Miss Ray came out he stepped up with a pistol in each hand. One he fired at her, and killed her on the spot. The other he discharged at himself, but without fatal effect. He was at once arrested, and when his wound had been dressed, was committed by Sir John Fielding to Tothill Fields, and afterwards to Newgate. He wrote from prison to the same friend as follows: "I am alive, and she is dead. I shot her, and not myself. Some of her blood and brains are still upon my clothes. I don't ask you to speak to me. I don't ask you to look at me. Only come hither and bring me a little poison, such as is strong enough. Upon my knees I beg, if your friendship for me ever was sincere, do bring me some poison." Next day he was more composed, and declared that nothing should tempt him to escape justice by suicide. "My death," he writes, "is all the recompense I can make to the laws of my country." He was tried before Mr. Justice Blackstone of the Commentaries, and convicted on the clearest evidence. A plea of insanity was set up in his defence, but could not be maintained. His dignified address to the jury had nothing of madness in it, and it is probable that he had no real desire to escape the judgment for his crime. This is shown by his answer to Lord Sandwich, who wrote, 17th April 1779, to Mr. Hackman in Newgate: "If the murderer of Miss wishes to live, the man he has most injured will use all his interest to procure his life." To this Hackman replied: "The condemned cell in Newgate, 17th April 1779. The murderer of her whom he preferred, far preferred to life, respects the hand from which he has just received such an offer as he neither desires nor deserves. His wishes are for death, not life. One wish he has. Could he be pardoned in this world by the man he has most injured? Oh, my lord, when I meet her in another world, enable me to tell her, if departed spirits are not ignorant of earthly things, that you forgive us both, that you will be a father to her dear infants. J. H." The condemned man continued to fill many sheets with his reflections in the shape of letters to his friend, but they are all rhapsodical to the last degree. The 19th April was the day fixed for his execution, and on that morning he rose at 5 o'clock, dressed himself, and spent some time in private meditation. About 7 o'clock he was visited by Mr. Boswell and some other friends, with whom he went to the chaplain and partook of the sacrament. During the procession to Tyburn he seemed much affected, and said but little. After having hung the usual time his body was carried to Surgeons' Hall. He appears to have written a few last words in pencil at Tyburn while actually waiting to be turned off. "My dear Charlie," he wrote, "farewell for ever in this world. I die a sincere Christian and penitent, and everything I hope you can wish me. Would it prevent my examples having any bad effect if the world should know how I abhor my former ideas of suicide? My crime will be the best judge. Of her fame I charge you to be careful. My poorly will. Your dying H." Miss Ray was buried at Elstree, Herts, where her grave is still pointed out. 20 years elapsed between the commission of the murder with which Governor Wall was charged, and his trial and atonement. The date of his execution was 1802, a date which would bring the story within the scope of a later rather than the present chapter. But while postponing the particulars of the execution, I propose to deal here with the offence, as it falls naturally into this branch of my subject. Colonel Wall was governor and commandant of Goree, a small island off the coast of Africa, close to Cape Verde, and now in the possession of the French. It was mainly dependent upon England for its supplies, and when these ran short, as was often the case, the troops received a money compensation in lieu of rations. A sum was due to them in this way on one occasion when both the governor and paymaster were on the point of leaving the island for England, and a number of men, anxious for an adjustment of their claims, set off in a body to interview the paymaster at his quarters. They were encountered en route by the governor, who reprimanded them and ordered them to return to their barracks. An hour or two later a second party started for the paymaster, at the head of which was a certain Sergeant Armstrong. The governor met them as before, and addressing himself to Sergeant Armstrong, again ordered the men back to their quarters. Upon the nature of this demonstration the whole of the subsequent proceedings hinged. Governor Wall and his witnesses declared it was a tumultuous gathering, 70 or 80 strong. Other testimony limited the number to about a dozen. Governor Wall alleged that the men with Armstrong were armed and menacing, others that they comported themselves in a quiet, orderly manner. It was sworn that Armstrong, when spoken to by the governor, came up to him submissively, hat in hand, addressed him as "Your Excellency," used no disrespectful language, and withdrew with his comrades without noise or disturbance. This view was supported by the evidence of several officers, who swore that they saw no appearance of a mutiny on the island that day. On the other hand, the governor urged that the men had declared they would break open the stores and help themselves if they were not settled with at once; that they prevented him from going to the shore, fearing he meant to leave the island in a hurry; and that they forced the main guard and released a prisoner. It is difficult to reconcile statements so widely divergent, but the fact that Governor Wall left the island next day, and took with him 3 officers out of the 7 in the garrison, that he made no special report of the alleged mutiny to the military authorities in London, and did not even refer to it in minute returns prepared and forwarded at the time, must be deemed very detrimental to Governor Wall's case, and no doubt weighed with the jury which tried him. The only conclusion was that no mutiny existed, but one was assumed merely to screen the infliction of an unauthorized punishment. To return to the events on the island, it is pretty certain that Governor Wall's mind must have been thrown off its balance after he had dismissed the party headed by Armstrong. He was either actually apprehensive for the safety of his command, or was momentarily blinded by passion at the seeming defiance of discipline, and he felt that he must make an example if his authority was to be maintained. Although many old comrades of high rank bore witness at his trial to his great humanity and good temper, there is reason to fear that to those under his command he was so severe and unaccommodating as to be generally unpopular, and this no doubt told against him at his trial. He was not a strong, self-reliant commander. It is nearly certain that he gave trifles exaggerated importance, and was only too ready to put in practice the severest methods of repression he had at hand. In this instance, however, he did not act without deliberation. It was not until 6 in the evening that he had resolved to punish Armstrong as the ringleader of the mutiny. By that time he had fully laid his plans. The long roll was beat upon the drums. The troops were assembled hurriedly as in the case of alarm, and a gun carriage was dragged into the centre of the parade. The governor then constituted a drumhead court-martial, which proceeded to try Armstrong for mutiny, convict, and sentence him without calling upon him to plead to any charge, or hearing him in his defence, so that he was practically punished without a trial. He was ordered 800 lashes, which were forthwith inflicted, not as in ordinary cases by the regimental drummers, whom the governor thought were tinged with insubordination, but by the black interpreters and his assistants. Nor was the regulation cat of 9 tails used, as the governor declared they had all been destroyed by the mutineers, but a very thick rope's end, which, according to the surgeon's testimony, did more mischief than the cat. Armstrong's punishment was exemplary. It was proved that the governor stood by, threatening to flog the blacks themselves unless they laid on with a will, and crying again and again, "Cut him to the heart, cut him to the liver." Armstrong begged for mercy, but he received the whole 800 lashes, 25 at a time, and when he was cast loose, he said that the sick season was coming on, which with the punishment would certainly do for him. A surgeon was present at the infliction, but was not called upon to certify as to Armstrong's fitness or otherwise for corporal punishment, nor did he enter any protest. Armstrong was taken at once to hospital, and his back was found as black as a new hat. From the moment of his reception, the doctors had no hope of his recovery. He gradually grew worse and presently died. The day after the punishment, Governor Wall left Goree and came to England, where he arrived in August 1782. The news of Armstrong's death followed him, and various reports as to the governor's conduct, which were inquired into and dismissed. But in 1784 a more detailed and circumstantial account came to hand, and 2 messengers were dispatched to Bath by Lord Sidney, then Secretary of State, to arrest Wall. They apprehended him and brought him as far as Reading in a chaise and 4, where they alighted at an inn. While the officers were at supper he gave them the slip and got over to France, whence he wrote promising to surrender in the course of a few months. His excuse for absconding was that many of those who would be the principal witnesses were his personal enemies. He continued abroad, however, for some years, residing sometimes in Italy, more constantly in France, where he lived respectably and was admitted into good company. He affected the society of countrymen serving in the French army, and was well known to the Scotch and Irish colleges in Paris. In 1797 he returned to England, and remained in hiding, occupying lodgings in Lambeth Court, where his wife, who was a lady of good family, regularly visited him. He was described as being unsettled in mind at this time, and even then contemplating surrender. His means of subsistence were rather precarious, but he lived at the time of delivering himself up in Upper Thornhaugh Street, Bedford Square. In October 1801 he wrote twice to Lord Pelham, stating that he had returned to England for the purpose of meeting the charge against him. It was generally supposed that, had he not thus come forward voluntarily, the matter had nearly passed out of people's memory, and he would hardly have been molested. He was, however, arrested on his own letter, committed to Newgate, and tried at the Old Bailey for the murder of Benjamin Armstrong at Gorey in 1782. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. After several respites and strenuous exertions to save his life, he was executed in front of Newgate on the 28th January 1802. The whole of one day was occupied by the judges and law officers in reviewing his case, but their opinion was against him. 3 persons of note and superior station found themselves in Newgate about, but rather before, this time upon a charge of murder. The first was James Quin, the celebrated actor, the popular diner out and bon vivant, who went to the west coast of England to eat John Dory in perfection, and who preferred eating turtle in Bristol to London. He made his first hit as Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor. He had understudied the part, but Rich, manager of the Theatre Royal, London's Inn Fields, substituted him for it in an emergency with great reluctance. His next hit was as Cato, in which, with many other parts, he succeeded Booth. Quin was modest enough on his first appearance as Cato to announce that the part would be attempted by Mr. Quin. The audience were, however, fully satisfied with his performance, and after one critical passage was applauded with shouts of "Booth outdone." It was through this, his great part Cato, that he was led into the quarrel which laid him open to the charge of murder. One night in 1769, an inferior actor named Williams, taking the part of messenger, said, "Caesar sends health to Cato," but pronounced Cato Quito. Quin, much annoyed, replied instantly with a gag, "Would that he had sent a better messenger." Williams was now greatly incensed, and in the green room later in the evening complained bitterly to Quin that he had been made ridiculous, that his professional prospects were blighted, and that he insisted upon satisfaction or an apology. Quin only laughed at his rage. Williams, goaded to madness, went out into the piazza at Covent Garden to watch for Quin. When the latter left the theatre, Williams attacked him with his sword. Quin drew in his defence, and after a few passes ran Williams through the body. The ill-fated actor died on the spot. Quin surrendered himself, was committed, tried, found guilty of manslaughter, and was sentenced to be burned in the hand. Another well-known actor, Charles Macklin, was no less unfortunate in incurring the stain of blood. He was a hot-headed, intemperate Irishman who, when he had an engagement at Drury Lane Theatre, quarrelled with another actor over a wig. Going down between the pieces into the scene-room, where the players warmed themselves, he saw a Mr. Hallam, who was to appear as Sancho in the Fop's Fortune, wearing a stock wig which he, Macklin, had on the night before. He swore at him for a rogue, and cried, "What business have you with my wig?" The other answered that he had as much right to it as Macklin, but presently went away and changed it for another. Macklin still would not leave the man alone, and taking the wig, began to comb it out, making grumbling and abusive remarks, and a scrub rascal. Hallam replied that he was no more a rascal than Macklin was, upon which the latter started from his chair, and having a stick in his hand, made a full lunge at the actor, and thrust the stick into his left eye. Pulling it back again, he looked pale, turned on his heel, and in a passion threw the stick on the fire. Hallam clapped his hand to his eye, and said the stick had gone through his head. Young Mr. Cibber, the manager's son, came in, and a doctor was sent for. The injured man was removed to a bed, where he expired the following day. Macklin was very contrite and concerned at his rash act, for which he was arrested, and in due course tried at the Old Bailey. Many of the most renowned actors of the day, Rich, Fleetwood, Quin, Ryan, and others, bore testimony to his good character and his quiet, peaceable disposition. He also was found guilty of manslaughter only, and sentenced to be burnt in the hand. The third case of killing by misadventure was that of Joseph Baretti, the author of the well-known Italian and English dictionary. Baretti had resided in England for some years, engaged upon this work. He was a middle-aged, respectable man of studious habits, the friend and associate of the most noted literary men and artists of the day. He was a member of the Club of the Royal Academicians at that time, 1769, lodged in Soho, and went there one afternoon after a long morning's work over his proofs. Finding no one at the club, he went on to the Orange Coffee House, and returning by the Haymarket to the club, was madly assaulted by a woman at the corner of Panton Street. Very unwisely he resented her attack by giving her a blow with his hand, when the woman, finding by his accent he was a foreigner, cried for help against the cursed Frenchman, when there was at once a gathering of bullies, who jostled and beat Baretti, making him apprehensive that he must expect no favour nor protection, but all outrage and blows. There was generally a great puddle at the corner of Panton Street, even when the weather was fine, and on this particular day it had rained incessantly, and the pavement was very slippery. Baretti's assailants tried hard to push him into the puddle, and at last, in self-defence, he drew his pocket-knife, a knife he kept, as he afterwards declared, to carve fruit and sweetmeats, and not to kill his fellow creatures with, being hard pushed in great horror, having such bad eyes, lest he should run against some, and his pursuers constantly at him, jostling and beating him. Baretti made a quick blow at one who had knocked off his hat with his fist. The mob cried, "Murder! He has a knife out!" and gave way. Baretti ran up Oxenden Street, then faced about and ran into a shop for protection, being quite spent with fatigue. 3 men followed him. One was a constable, who had called upon Baretti to surrender. Morgan, the man whom he had stabbed 3 times, as it appeared, the third wound having hurt him more than the 2 former, was fast bleeding to death. Baretti was carried before Sir John Fielding. His friends came from the club and testified to his character, among others Sir Joshua Reynolds himself, but he was committed to prison. It was urged in Baretti's defence that he had been very severely handled. He had a swollen cheek, and was covered with bruises. Independent witnesses came forward, and swore that they had been subjected to personal outrage in the neighbourhood of the Haymarket. A number of personal friends, including Sir Joshua Reynolds, Dr. Johnson, Mr. Fitzherbert, and Mr. Edmund Burke, spoke in the highest terms of Mr. Baretti as a man of benevolence, sobriety, modesty, and learning. In the end he was acquitted of murder or manslaughter, and the jury gave a verdict of self-defence. End of Later Records, Part 2.
Section 16 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by Arthur Griffiths. Chapter 10. Highwaymen and Pirates. Chronic dangers and riots in the London streets. Footmen's riot at Drury Lane. James Maclean, a notorious knight of the road, has a lodging in St. James Street. Stops Horace Walpole, hanged at Maidstone. John Wren, alias 16-string Jack, short career ends on the gallows. William Parsons, a baronet's son, turns swindler and is transported to Virginia. Jonathan Wild, the sham thief-taker and notorious criminal Captain Kidd, English peers accused of complicity. Kidd's arrest, trial, and sentence. John Gow and his career in The Revenge, his death at execution dock. Inoffensive persons were constantly in danger, day and night, of being waylaid and maltreated in the streets. Disturbance was chronic in certain localities, and a trifling quarrel might at any moment blaze into a murderous riot. On execution days the mob was always rampant, At times, too, when political passion was at fever heat, crowds of roughs were ever ready to espouse the popular cause. Thus, when the court party headed by Lord Bute vainly strove to crush the demagogue John Wilkes, and certain prisoners were being tried at the Old Bailey for riot and wounding, a crowd collected outside the Mansion House, carrying a gibbet on which hung a boot and a petticoat. The mayor interfered, and a fray began. Weapons were used. Some of the Lord Mayor's servants were wounded, and one of the prisoners was rescued by the mob. Sometimes the disturbance had its origin in trade jealousies. An especially turbulent class were the footmen, chairmen, and body servants of the aristocracy. The footmen's riot at Drury Lane Theatre, which occurred in 1737, was a serious affair. It had long been the custom to admit the party-colored tribe, as the licensed lackeys are called in the contemporary accounts, to the upper gallery of that theatre, gratis, out of compliment to their masters on whom they were in attendance. Then, when established among the gods, they comported themselves with extraordinary license. They impudently insulted the rest of the audience, who, unlike themselves, had paid for admission, and, assuming the prerogative of critics, hissed or applauded with the most offensive clamor. Finding the privilege of free entrance thus scandalously abused, Mr. Fleetwood, the manager, suspended the free list. This gave great offense to the footmen, who proceeded to take the law into their own hands. They conceived, as it was stated in Fogg's Weekly Journal, that they had an indefeasible hereditary right to the said gallery, and that this expulsion was a high infringement of their liberties. Accordingly, one Saturday night, a great number of them, quite 300 it was said, assembled at Drury Lane doors, armed with staves and truncheons, and well fortified with 3 threads and 2 penny. The night selected was one when the performance was patronized by royalty, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, with other members of the royal family, were in the theatre. The rioters attacked the stage door and forced it open, bearing down on all the box-keepers, candle-snuffers, supernumeraries, and pippin women that stood in the way. In this onslaught some 25 respectable people were desperately wounded. Fortunately, Colonel de Vale, an active Westminster justice, happened to be in the house, and at once interposed. He ordered the Riot Act be read, but so great was the confusion, says the account, that they might as well have read Caesar's Commentaries. Colonel de Vale then got the assistance of some of the guards, and with them seized several of the principal rioters, whom he committed to Newgate. The prisoners were looked upon as martyrs to the great cause, and while in jail were liberally supplied with all luxuries by the subscription of their brethren. They were, however, brought to trial, convicted of riot, and sentenced to imprisonment. This did not quite end the disturbance. Anonymous letters poured into the theatre threatening Fleetwood and vowing vengeance. The following is a specimen. Sir, we are willing to admonish you before we attempt our design, and provide you use us civil and admit us into your gallery, which is our property according to formalities, and if you think proper to come to a composition, this way you'll hear no further, and if not, our intention is to combine in a body incognito and reduce the playhouse to the ground. Valuing no detection, we are indemnified. The manager carried these letters to the Lord Chamberlain, and appealed to him for protection. A detachment of guards, 50 strong, was ordered to do duty at the theatre nightly, and thus deterred the saucy knaves from carrying their threats into execution. From this time, says the Newgate Calendar, the gallery has been purged of such vermin. The footmen and male servants generally of this age were an idle, dissolute race. From among them the ranks of the highwaymen were commonly recruited, and it was very usual for the gentleman's gentleman, who had long flaunted in his master's apparel and imitated his master's vices, to turn gentleman on the road to obtain funds for the faro table and riotous living. A large proportion of the most famous highwaymen of the 18th century had been in service at some time or other. Hawkins, James Maclean, John Rann, William Page had all worn the livery coat. John Hawkins had been butler to a gentleman's family, but lost his place when the plate chest was robbed, and suspicion fell upon him because he was flush of money. Hawkins, without a character, was unable to get a fresh place, and he took at once to the road. His operations, which were directed chiefly against persons of quality, were conducted in and about London. He stopped and robbed the Earl of Burlington, Lord Bruce, and the Earl of Westmoreland, the latter in Lincoln's Inn Fields. When he got valuable jewels, he carried them over to Holland and disposed of them for cash, which he squandered at once in a hell, for he was a rash and inveterate gambler. Working with 2 associates, he made his headquarters at a public house in the London Wall, the master of which kept a livery stable and shared in the booty. From this point they rode out at all hours and stopped the stages as they came into town laden with passengers. One of the gang was, however, captured in the act of robbing the mail and executed at Aylesbury. After this, by way of revenge, they all determined to turn mail robbers. They first designed to stop the Harwich mail, but changed their mind as its arrival was uncertain, being dependent on the passage of the packet-boat, and determined to rob the Bristol mail instead. They overtook the boy carrying the bags near Slough, and made him go down a lane where they tied him to a tree in a wet ditch, ransacked the Bath and Bristol bags, and hurried off by a circuitous route to London, where they divided the spoil, sharing the banknotes and throwing the letters into the fire. Soon after this, the post office, having learned that the public house in the London Wall was the resort of highwaymen, it was closely watched. One of Hawkins' gang became alarmed, and was on the point of bolting to Newcastle when he was arrested. He was hesitating whether or not he should confess when he found that he had been forestalled by an associate, who had already given information to the post office, and he also made a clean breast of it all. The rest of the gang were taken at their lodgings in the Old Bailey, but not without a fight, and committed to Newgate. Hawkins tried to set up an alibi, and an innkeeper swore that he lodged with him at Bedfordbury on the night of the robbery. But the jury found him guilty, and he was hanged at Tyburn, his body being afterwards hung in chains on Hounslow Heath. The defense of an alibi was very frequently pleaded by highwaymen, and the tradition of its utility may explain why that veteran and astute coachman, Mr. Weller, suggested it in the case of Bardell versus Pickwick. In one genuine case, however, it nearly failed, and 2 innocent men were all but sacrificed to mistaken identity. They had been arrested for having robbed, on the Uxbridge Road, a learned sergeant-at-law, Sir Thomas Davenport, who swore positively to both. His evidence was corroborated by that of Lady Davenport and by the coachman and footman. Also the horses, ridden by the supposed highwaymen, one a brown and the other a grey, were produced in the Old Bailey courtyard and sworn to. Yet it was satisfactorily proved that both the prisoners were respectable residents of Kentish Town, that one, at the exact time of the robbery, was seated at a table dining at some club anniversary dinner and never left the club room, that the other was employed continuously in the bar of a public house kept by his mother. It was proved, too, that the prisoners owned a brown and a grey horse respectively. The judge summed up in the prisoners' favor, and they were acquitted. But both suffered severe mental trouble from the unjust accusation. A few years later the actual robbers were convicted of another offence, and in the cells of Newgate confessed that it was they who had stopped Sir Thomas Davenport. A very notorious highwayman, who had also been in service at one time of his varied career, was James Maclean. He was the son of a dissenting minister in Monaghan, and had a brother, a minister, at the Hague. Maclean inherited a small fortune, which he speedily dissipated, after which he became a gentleman's butler, lost his situation through dishonesty, determined to enlist in the Horse Guards, abandoned the idea, and turned fortune-hunter. He was a vain man, of handsome exterior, which he decked out in smart clothes on borrowed money. He succeeded at length in winning the daughter of a respectable London horse-dealer, and with her dowry of £500 set up in business as a grocer. His wife dying early, he at once turned his stock in trade into cash, and again looked to win an heiress, by the gracefulness of his person and the elegance of his appearance. He was at last reduced to his last shilling, and being quite despondent, an Irish apothecary, who was a daring robber, persuaded him to take to the highway. One of his earliest exploits was to stop Horace Walpole when the latter was passing through Hyde Park. A pistol went off accidentally in the encounter, and the bullet not only grazed Walpole's cheekbone, but went through the roof of the carriage. At this time Maclean had a lodging in St. James Street, for which he paid 2 guineas a week. His accomplice Plunkett lived in Jermyn Street. "Their faces," says Horace Walpole, "are as well known about St. James as any gentleman's who lives in that quarter, and who perhaps goes upon the road too." Maclean accounted for his style of living by putting out that he had Irish property worth £700 a year. Once, when he had narrowly escaped capture, he went over to his brother in Holland for safety, and when the danger was past, he returned and recommenced his depredations. He made so good a show that he was often received into respectable houses, and once was near marrying a young lady of good position, but he was recognized and exposed by a gentleman who knew him. Maclean continued to rob with still greater boldness till the 26th June 1750. On this day he and Plunkett robbed the Earl of Eglinton on Hounslow Heath. Later in the day they stopped and rifled the Salisbury stage, and among the booty carried off 2 portmanteaus, which were conveyed to Maclean's lodgings in St. James. Information of this robbery was quickly circulated, with a description of the stolen goods. Maclean had stripped the lace off of a waistcoat, the property of one of his victims, and recklessly offered it for sale to the very laceman from whom it had been purchased. He also sent for another salesman, who immediately recognized the clothes offered as those which had been stolen, and pretending to go home for more money, he fetched a constable and apprehended Maclean. He made an elaborate defence when brought to trial, but it availed him little, and he was sentenced to death. While under condemnation he became quite a popular hero. The first Sunday after his trial, says Horace Walpole, 3,000 people went to see him. He fainted away twice with the heat of his cell. You can't conceive the ridiculous rage there is for going to Newgate, and the prints that are published of the malefactors, and the memoirs of their lives, set forth with as much parade as martial tureens. Maclean suffered at Tyburn amidst a great concourse. William Page did a better business as a highwayman than Maclean. Page was apprenticed to a haberdasher, but he was a consummate coxcomb, who neglected his shop to dress in the fashion and frequent public places. His relations turned him adrift, and when in the last stage of distress he accepted a footman's place. It was while in livery that he first heard of what highwaymen could do, and conceived the idea of adopting the road as a profession. His first exploits were on the Kentish road, when he stopped the Canterbury stage. His next near Hampton Court. When he had collected some £200, he took lodgings in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and passed as a student of law. He learnt to dance, frequented assemblies, and was on the point of marrying well, when he was recognized as a discharged footman, and turned out of doors. He continued his depredations all this time, assisted by a curious map which he had himself drawn, giving the roads round London for 20 miles. His plan was to drive out in a phaeton and pair. When at a distance from town, he would turn into some unfrequented place and disguise himself with a grizzle or black wig, and put on other clothes. Then, saddling on one of his phaeton horses, he went on to the main road and committed a robbery. This effected, he galloped back to his carriage, resumed his former dress, and drove to London. He was often cautioned against himself, but laughingly said that he had already lost his money once, and could now only lose his coat and shirt. He was nearly detected on one occasion, when some haymakers discovered his empty phaeton and drove it off with his best clothes. He had just stopped some people who pursued the haymakers with the carriage, and accused them of being accomplices in the robbery. Page heard of this, and throwing the disguise into a well, went back to town nearly naked, where he claimed the carriage, saying the men had stripped him and thrown him into a ditch. The coach builder swore that he had sold him the carriage, and they were committed for trial. but Page did not appear to prosecute. Page after this extended his operation, and in company with one Darwell, an old schoolfellow, committed more than 300 robberies in 3 years. He frequented Bath, Tunbridge, Newmarket, and Scarborough, playing deep everywhere and passing for a man of fortune. Darwell and he next worked the roads around London, but while the former was near Seven Oaks, he was captured by Justice Fielding. He turned evidence against Page, who was arrested in consequence at the Golden Lion near Hyde Park, with a wig to disguise him in one pocket, and his map of the London roads in another. He was remanded to Newgate and tried for a robbery, of which he was acquitted. Then removed to Maidstone, and convicted of another for which he was hanged at that place in 1758. John Rann was first a helper, then postboy, then coachman to several gentlemen of position. While in this capacity he dressed in a peculiar fashion, wearing breeches with 8 strings at each knee, and was hence nicknamed 16-string Jack. Having lost his character, he turned pickpocket, and then took to the road. He was soon afterwards arrested for robbing a gentleman of a watch and some money on the Hounslow Road. The watch was traced to a woman with whom Rann kept company, who owned that she had it from him. Rann denied all knowledge of the transaction, which could not be brought home to him. He appeared in court on this occasion in an extravagant costume. His irons were tied up with blue ribbons, and he carried in his breast a bouquet of flowers as big as a broom. He was fond of fine feathers. Soon afterwards he appeared at a public house in Bagnigge Wells, dressed in a scarlet coat, tambour waistcoat, white silk stockings, and laced hat. He gave himself out quite openly as a highwayman, and getting drunk and troublesome, he was put out of the house through a window into the road. Later on he appeared at Barnet races in elegant sporting style, his waistcoat being blue satin trimmed with silver. On this occasion he was followed by hundreds who knew him, and wished to stare at a man who had made himself so notorious. At last he stopped Dr. Bell, chaplain to the Prince Amelia in the Uxbridge Road, and robbed him of 18d in a common watch in a tortoise-shell case. The latter was traced to the same woman already mentioned, and Rann was arrested coming into her house. Dr. Bell swore to him, and his servant declared that he had seen Rann riding up Acton Hill 20 minutes before the robbery. Rann was convicted on this evidence, and suffered at Tyburn in 1774, after a short career of 4 years. It was not the first time he had seen the gallows. A short time previously he had attended a public execution, and forcing his way into the ring kept by the constables, he begged that he might be allowed to stand there, as he might some day be an actor in the scene instead of a spectator. The road was usually the last resource of the criminally inclined, the last fatal step in the downward career which ended abruptly at the gallows. Dissolute and depraved youths of all classes, often enough gentlemen, undoubtedly well born, adopted this dangerous profession when at their wits' end for funds. William Butler, who did his work accompanied by his servant Jack, was the son of a military officer. Kent in Essex was his favourite line of country, but London was his headquarters, where they lived in the genteelest lodgings, Jack wearing a livery, and the squire dressed in the most elegant manner. A baronet, Sir Simon Clarke, was convicted of highway robbery at Winchester Assizes, with an associate, Lieutenant Robert Arnott, although the former, by the strenuous exertions of his country friends, escaped the death penalty to which he had been sentenced. A very notorious highwayman executed in 1750 was William Parson, the son of a baronet who had been at Eton and bore a commission in the Royal Navy. He had hopes of an inheritance from the Duchess of Northumberland, who was a near relative, but her Grace altered her will in favour of his sister. He left the Navy in a hurry, and, abandoned by his friends, became quite destitute, when his father got him an appointment in the Royal African Company's service. But he soon quarrelled with the governor of Fort James on the Gambia, and returned to England again so destitute that he lived on 3 halfpence for 4 days, and drank water from the street pumps. His father now told him to enlist in the Life Guards, but the necessary purchase money, 70 guineas was not forthcoming. He then, by personating a brother, obtained an advance on a legacy which an aunt held left the brother, and with these funds made so good a show that he managed to marry a young lady of independent fortune, whose father was dead and had bequeathed her a handsome estate. His friends were so delighted that they obtained him a commission as ensign in a marching regiment, the 34th. He immediately launched into an extravagant expenditure, took a house in Poland Street, kept 3 saddle horses, a chaise, a pair, and a retinue of servants. He also fell into the hands of a noted gambler and sharper, who induced him to play high and fleeced him. Parsons was compelled to sell his commission to meet his liabilities, and still had to evade his creditors by hiding under a false name. From this time he became an irreclaimable vagabond, put to all sorts of shifts and adroit in all kinds of swindles to raise means. Having starved for some time, he shipped as captain of marines on board a galley privateer. He returned and lived by forgery and fraud. One counterfeit draft he drew was on the Duke of Cumberland for £500, another on Sir Joseph Hankey and Company. He defrauded tailors out of new uniforms, and a hatter out of 160 hats which he pretended he had contracted to supply his regiment. He also robbed a jeweller by a pretended marriage of a wedding and several valuable diamond rings. In the 45 he borrowed a horse from an officer intending to join the rebels, but he only rode as far as Smithfield, where he sold the nag, and let the officer be arrested as a supposed traitor. He was arrested for obtaining money on a false draft at Ranelagh, tried at Maidstone, sentenced to transportation, and dispatched to Virginia. There, after working as a common slave about 7 weeks, a certain Lord F. rescued him and took him as a guest into his house. Parsons robbed Lord F. of a horse and took the highway. With the proceeds of his first robbery, he got a passage back to England. On arriving at Whitehaven, he represented himself as having come into a large estate, and a banker advanced him £70. With this he came on to London, took lodgings in the West End near Hyde Park Corner, and rapidly got through his cash. Then he hired a horse and rode out onto the Hounslow Heath to stop the first person he met. This became his favourite hunting ground, although he did business also about Kensington and Turnham Green. Once having learnt that a footman was to join his master at Windsor with a portmanteau full of notes and money, he rode out to rob him, but was recognized by an old victim. The latter let him enter the town of Hounslow, then ordered him to surrender. He might still have escaped, but the landlord of the inn where he lodged thought he answered the description of a highwayman who had long infested the neighbourhood. Parsons was accordingly detained and removed to Newgate. He was easily identified, and his condemnation for returning from transportation followed as a matter of course. His father and his wife used all their interest to gain him a pardon, but he was deemed too old an offender to be a fit object for mercy. Paul Lewis was another reprobate who began life as a king's officer. He was the son of a country clergyman who got him a commission in the train of artillery. But Lewis ran into debt, deserted from his corps, and took to the sea. He entered the Royal Navy and rose to be first midshipman, then lieutenant. Although courageous in action, he was wicked and base, and while on board the fleet he collected 3 guineas apiece from his messmates to lay in stores for the West Indian voyages, and bolted with the money. He at once took to the road. His first affair was near Newington Butts, when he robbed a gentleman in a chaise. He was apprehended for this offence, but escaped conviction through an alibi. After this he committed a variety of robberies. He was captured by a police officer on a night that he had first stopped a lady and gentleman in a chaise, and then tried to rob a Mr. Brown, at whom he fired. Mr. Brown's horse took to fright and threw him, but when he got to his feet he found his assailant pinned to the ground by Mr. Pope, the police officer, who was kneeling on his breast. It seemed the lady and gentleman, Lewis's first victims, had warned Pope that a highwayman was about, and the police officer had ridden forward quickly and seized Lewis at the critical moment. Lewis was conveyed to Newgate and in due course sentenced to death. Such was the baseness and unfeeling profligacy of this wretch, says the Newgate calendar, that when his almost heartbroken father visited him for the first time in Newgate and put 12 guineas into his hand to repay his expenses, he slipped one of the pieces of gold into the cuff of his sleeve by a dexterous sleight, and then, opening his hand, showed the venerable and reverend old man that they were but 11, upon which his father took another from his pocket and gave it to him to make the number intended. Having then taken a last farewell of his parent, Lewis turned round to his fellow prisoners and exultingly exclaimed, "I have flung the old fellow out of another guinea." Pope's capture of the highwayman Lewis was outdone by that of William Belchier, a few years previous by William Norton, a person who, according to his own account of himself, kept a shop in Wych Street, and who sometimes took a thief. Norton, at the trial, told his story as follows: "The chaise to Devizes having been robbed 2 or 3 times, as I was informed, I was desired to go into it to see if I could take the thief, which I did on the 3rd of June, about half an hour after 1 in the morning. I got into the post chaise. The postboy told me the place where he had been stopped was near the halfway house between Knightsbridge and Kensington. As we came near the house, the prisoner, Belchier, came to us on foot, and said, 'Driver, stop.' He held a pistol and tinder box to the chaise, and said, 'Your money directly. You must not stop. This minute. Your money.' I said, 'Don't frighten us. I have but a trifle. You shall have it.' Then I said to the gentleman, there were 3 in the chaise, 'Give your money.' I took out a pistol from my coat pocket, and from my breeches pocket a 5-shilling piece and $1. I held the pistol concealed in one hand and the money in the other. I held the money pretty hard. He said, 'Put it in my hat.' I let him take the 5-shilling piece out of my hand. As soon as he had taken it, I snapped my pistol at him. It did not go off. He staggered back and held up his hands and said, 'Oh Lord, oh Lord.' I jumped out of the chaise. He ran away, and I after him, about 600 or 700 yards, and then took him. I hit him a blow on his back. He begged for mercy on his knees. I took his neckcloth off and tied his hands with it, and brought him back to the chaise. Then I told the gentlemen in the chaise that was the errand I came upon, and wished them a good journey, and brought the prisoner to London." No account of the thief-taking or of the criminality of the 18th century would be complete without some reference to Jonathan Wild. What this astute villain really was may be best gathered from the various sworn informations on which he was indicted. It was set forth that he had been for years the confederate of highwaymen, pickpockets, burglars, shoplifters, and other thieves, that he had formed a kind of corporation of thieves of which he was head or director, and that despite his pretended efforts at detection, he procured none to be hanged but those who concealed their booty or refused him his share. It was said that he had divided the town and country into districts, and had appointed distinct gangs to each, who accounted to him for their robberies; that he employed another set to rob in churches during divine service, and other moving detachments to attend at court on birthdays and balls, and at houses of Parliament. His chosen agents were returned transports, who lay quite at his mercy. They could not be evidence against him, and if they displeased him, he could at any time have them hanged. These felons he generally lodged in a house of his own, where he fed and clothed them, and used them in clipping guineas or counterfeiting coin. Wild at last had the audacity to occupy a house in the Old Bailey, opposite the present Sessions House. He himself had been a confederate in numerous robberies. In all cases he was a receiver of the goods stolen. He had under his care several warehouses for concealing the same, and owned a vessel for carrying off jewels, watches, and other valuables to Holland, where he had a superannuated thief for a factor. He also kept in his pay several artists to make alterations and transform watches, seals, snuff-boxes, rings, so that they might not be recognized, which he used to present to people who could be of service to him. It was alleged that he generally claimed as much as half the value of all articles which he pretended to recover, and that he never gave up banknotes or paper unless the loser could exactly specify them. In order to carry out these vile practices and to gain some credit with the ignorant multitude, he usually carried a short silver staff as a badge of authority from the government, which he used to produce when he himself was concerned in robbing. Last of all, he was charged with selling human blood, in other words, of procuring false evidence to convict innocent persons, sometimes to prevent them from giving evidence against himself, at other times for the sake of the great reward offered by the government. Wilde's career was brought to an abrupt conclusion by the revelations made by two of his creatures. He absconded, but was pursued, captured, and committed to Newgate. He was tried on several indictments, but convicted on that of having maintained a secret correspondence with felons, receiving money for restoring stolen goods, and dividing it with the thieves whom he did not prosecute. While under sentence of death, he made desperate attempts to obtain a pardon, but in vain, and at last tried to evade the gallows by taking a large dose of laudanum. This also failed, and he was conveyed to Tyburn amidst the execrations of a countless mob of people who pelted him with stones and dirt all the way. Among the curious facts concerning this arch-villain, it is recorded that when at the acme of his prosperity, Jonathan Wild was ambitious of becoming a freeman of the city of London. His petition to this effect is contained among the records of the town clerk's office, and set forth that the petitioner has been at great trouble and charge in apprehending and convicting divers felons for returning from transportation from October 1720. That your petitioner has never received any reward or gratuity for such his service, and that he is very desirous of becoming a freeman of this honorable city. The names follow and include Moll King, John Jones, etc., who were notorious street robbers. The petition is endorsed as read January 2, 1724, but the results are not stated. Before closing this chapter, I must refer briefly to another class of highway robbers, the pirates and rovers who ranged the high seas in the first half of the 18th century. There were sometimes as many as 60 or 70 pirates at a time awaiting trial in Newgate about this period. In those days there was no efficient ocean police, no perpetual patrolling by warships of all nations to prevent and put down piracy as a crime noxious to all. Later on the ascendancy of the British Navy, this duty was more or less its peculiar province. But till then every sea was infested with pirates sailing under various flags. The growth of piracy has been attributed, no doubt with reason, to the narrow policy of Spain with regard to her transatlantic colonies. To baffle this colonial system, the European powers long tolerated, even encouraged, these reckless filibusters, who did not confine their ravages to the Spanish-American coast, but turned their hands, like nautical Ishmaels, against all the world. The mischief thus done was incalculable. About 1720, one notorious rover, Captain Roberts, took 400 sail. They were as clever in obtaining information as to the movements of rich prizes on the seas as were highwaymen concerning the traffic along the high roads. They were particularly cunning in avoiding warships, and knew exactly where to run for supplies. As Captain Johnson tells us, speaking of the West Indies in the opening pages of his History of Pirates, they have been so formidable and numerous that they have interrupted the trade of Europe in those parts, and our English merchants in particular have suffered more by their depredations than by the united force of France and Spain in the late war. Pirates were the curse of the North American waters when Lord Bellamont went as governor of New England in 1695, and no one was supposed to be more in their secrets at that time, or more conversant with their haunts and hiding place, than a certain Captain John Kidd of New York, who owned a small vessel and traded with the West Indies. Lord Bellamont's instructions were to put down piracy if he could, and Kidd was recommended to him as a fitting person to employ. For some reason or other Kidd was denied official status, but it was pointed out to Lord Bellamont that as the affair would not well admit delay, it was worthy of being undertaken by some private persons of rank and distinction, and carried into execution at their own expense, notwithstanding public encouragement was denied to it. Eventually the Lord Chancellor, Lord Somers, the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Romney, the Earl of Oxford, with some others, subscribed a sum of £6,000 to fit out an expedition from England, of which Kidd was to have the command, and he was granted a commission by letters patent under the Great Seal to take and seize pirates and bring them to justice. The profits of the adventure, less a fifth, which went to Kidd and another, were to be pocketed by the promoters of the enterprise, and this led subsequently to a charge of complicity with the pirates, which proved very awkward, especially for Lords Orford and Somers. Kidd sailed for New York in the Adventure Galley, and soon hoisted the black flag. From New York he steered for Madeira, thence to the Cape of Good Hope, and on to Madagascar. He captured all that came in his way: French ships, Portuguese, Moorish, even English ships engaged in legitimate and peaceful trade. Kidd shifted his flag to one of his prizes, and in her returned to the Spanish Main for supplies. Thence he sailed for various ports of the West Indies, and having disposed of much of his booty, steered for Boston. He had been preceded there by a merchant who knew of his piratical proceedings, and gave information to Lord Bellamont. Kidd was accordingly arrested on his arrival in New England. A full report was sent home, and a man of war, the Rochester, dispatched to bring Kidd to England for trial. As the Rochester became disabled, and Kidd's arrival was delayed, very great public clamor arose, caused and fed by political prejudices against Lord Bellamont and the other great lords, who were accused of an attempt to shield Kidd. It was moved in the House of Commons that the letters patent granted to the Earl of Bellamont and others respecting the goods taken from pirates were dishonorable to the king, against the law of nations, contrary to the laws and statutes of the realm, an invasion of property, and destructive to commerce. The motion was opposed, but the political opponents of Lord Somers and Lord Orford continued to accuse them of giving countenance to pirates, while Lord Bellamont was deemed no less culpable. The East India Company, which had suffered greatly by Kidd's depredations, and which had been refused letters of marque to suppress piracy in the Indian Ocean, joined in the clamor, and petitioned that Captain Kidd might be brought to speedy trial, and that the effects taken unjustly from the subjects of the Great Mogul may be returned to them as a satisfaction for their losses. It was ruled at last that Kidd should be examined at the bar of the House of Commons, with the idea of fixing part of his guilt on the parties who had been concerned in sending him on his expedition. Kidd was accordingly brought to England, and lodged first in the Marshalsea, the prison of the Admiralty Court, and afterward committed to Newgate. It was rumoured that Lord Halifax, who shared the political odium of Lord Somers and Orford, had sent privately for Kidd from Newgate to tamper with him, but the keeper of the jail, on being sent for, averred that it was false. It is more probable that the other side endeavoured to get Kidd to bear witness against Lord Somers and the rest, but at the bar of the House, where he made a very contemptible appearance, being in some degree intoxicated, Kidd fully exonerated them. Kidd discovered little or nothing, says Luttrell. In their subsequent impeachment they were notwithstanding charged with having been Kidd's accomplices, but the accusation broke down. Kidd in the meantime had been left to his fate. He was tried with his crew on several indictments for murder and piracy at the Admiralty Sessions of the Old Bailey, and hung in 1701. He must have prospered greatly in his short infamous career. According to Luttrell, his effects were valued at £200,000, and one witness alone, Koji Baba, a Persian merchant, charged him with robbing him in the Persian Gulf of £60,000. No case was made out against the above-mentioned peers. Lord Orford set up in his defence that in Kidd's affair he had acted legally and with a good intention towards the public, though to his own loss, and Lord Somers denied that he had ever seen or known anything of Kidd. Hume sums up the matter by declaring that the Commons in the whole course of the transaction had certainly acted from motives of faction and revenge. Other venues are of interest. John Gow, who took the piratical name of Captain Smith, was second mate of the George galley, which he conspired with half the crew to seize when on the voyage to Santa Cruz. On a given signal, the utterance of a password, who fires first, an attack was made on the first mate, surgeon, and supercargo, whose throats were cut. The captain, hearing a noise, came on deck, when one mutineer cut his throat and a second fired a couple of balls into his body. The ship's company consisted of 20. 4 were now disposed of, 8 were conspirators, and of the remaining 8, some of whom had concealed themselves below decks and some in the shrouds, 4 had joined the pirates. The other 4 were closely watched, and although allowed to range the ship at pleasure, they were often cruelly beaten. The ship was rechristened the Revenge. She mounted several guns, and the pirates steered her for the coast of Spain, where several prizes were taken. The first, a ship laden with salted cod from Newfoundland. The second, a Scotch ship bound to Italy with a cargo of pickled herrings. The third, a French ship laden with oil, wine, and fruit. The pirates also made a descent upon the Portuguese coast, and laid the people under contributions. Dissensions now arose in the ship's company. Gow had a certain amount of sense and courage, but his lieutenant was a brutal ruffian, often blinded by passion, and continually fomenting discord. At last he attempted to shoot Gow, but his pistol missed fire, and he was wounded himself by 2 of the pirates. He sprang down to the powder room and threatened to blow up the ship, but he was secured and put on board a vessel which had been ransacked and set free, the commander of it being desired to hand the pirate over to the first king's ship he met, to be dealt with according to his crimes. After this the pirates steered north for the Orkneys, of which Gow was a native, and after a safe passage anchored in a bay of one of the islands. While lying there, one of his crew, who had been forced into joining them, escaped to Kirkwall, where he gave information to a magistrate, and the sheriff issued a precept to the constables and others to seize the Revenge. Soon afterwards 10 more of the crew, also unwilling members of it, laid hands on the long boat, and reaching the mainland of Scotland, coasted along it as far as Leith, whence they made their way to Edinburgh, and were imprisoned as pirates. Gow, meanwhile, careless of his danger, lingered in the Orkneys, plundering and ransacking the dwelling houses to provide himself with provisions, and carrying off plate, linen, and all valuables on which they could lay hands. Arriving at an island named Calf Sound, Gow planned the robbery of an old schoolmate, a Mr. Fee, whom he sought to entrap, but Mr. Fee turned the tables upon him. Inviting Gow and several of the crew to an entertainment on shore, while they were carousing, Mr. Fee made his servants seize the pirates' boat, and then entering by different doors, fell upon the pirates themselves and made all prisoners. The rest, 28 in number, who were still afloat, were also captured by various artifices, and the whole, under orders of the Lord Chief Justice, were dispatched to the Thames in HMS Greyhound for trial at the Admiralty Court. They were committed to the Marshalsea, thence to Newgate, and arraigned at the Old Bailey, where Gow refused to plead, and was sentenced to be pressed to death. He pretended that he wished to save an estate for a relation, but when all preparations for carrying out the sentence were completed, he begged to be allowed to plead, and the judge, being informed, humanely granted his request. Gow and 6 others were eventually hanged at Execution Dock. Pirates who fell in with ships usually sought to gain recruits among the captured crews. The alternative was to walk the plank, or to be set adrift in an open boat, or landed on an uninhabited island. For those who thus agreed under compulsion, a still harder fate was often in store. Captain Massey was an unfortunate instance of this. While serving in the Royal African Company, he was for some time engaged in the construction of a fort upon the coast with a detachment of men. They ran short of food and suffered frightfully from flux. When at the point of death, a passing ship noticed their signals of distress and sent a boat on shore to bring them on board. The ship proved to be a pirate. Captain Massey did not actually join them, but he remained on board while several prizes were taken. However, he gave information at Jamaica. The pirate captain and others were arrested and hanged, and Captain Massey received the thanks of the governor, who offered him an appointment on the island. But Massey was anxious to return to England. whither he proceeded armed with strong letters of recommendation to the Lords of the Admiralty. To his intense surprise, instead of being caressed, he was taken into custody, tried, and eventually executed. His case evoked great sympathy. His joining the pirates was evidently an act of necessity, not choice, and he took the earliest opportunity of giving up his involuntary associates to justice, a conduct by which he surely merited the thanks of his country, and not the vengeance of the law. From the foregoing account, it is easy to draw conclusions concerning the state of public morals and manners in the 18th century. Both the atrocity of the crimes and the barbarity of the punishments surpass everything the 20th century can show, while to the populace, generally the highwayman and the bully were heroes. Though our century is by no means free from crime, we may congratulate ourselves that we have advanced beyond the 18th, at least so far as crimes of violence are concerned. End of section 16. End of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by author Griffiths.